From the vast rolling steppes of Central Asia to the heights of imperial conquest, the Mongol Empire is a saga like no other, a story of resilient nomads who transformed into one of the largest empires in history. Life for the Mongols during Genghis Khan's time revolved around the herd. In a harsh environment where farming was nearly impossible, Mongol families relied on their animals for sustenance, clothing, and trade. Moving with the seasons, they lived in circular tents called gers, quickly setting them up and taking them down as they traveled the steppes, embodying the nomadic spirit that would fuel their conquests. The Mongols' skill with horses and their remarkable adaptability gave them an edge in battle and in building their empire. They thrived on mobility and unity, qualities that forged an unstoppable military machine. Their famed loyalty and discipline were evident in daily life, where each member had a role. Men crafted weapons and hunted, while women managed the home and transformed milk into staple foods like cheese and butter. When they weren't on the move, the Mongols preserved their cultural traditions, even as they absorbed influences from conquered lands, adapting and expanding without losing their distinct identity. As the empire grew, so did its diversity. The Mongols fostered unprecedented religious tolerance, embracing beliefs from shamanism to Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. In Persia, they implemented tax relief for farmers, and in China, they promoted trade and cultural exchange. The Mongol Empire was a network of roads, a melting pot of faiths, and a hub for trade, connecting distant civilizations like never before. They left a legacy not just in warfare, but in commerce, innovation, and cultural exchange. Yet this empire was not without its hardships. For the conquered, Mongol rule brought a complex blend of oppression and opportunity. The Mongols' policies varied by region, sometimes decimating local economies, yet in other cases fostering urban growth and trade. From Russia to China, their rule left a lasting imprint, shaping the medieval world and resonating even in modern times. The Mongol Empire's rise and fall is a tale of relentless ambition, cultural convergence, and the resilience of human society in the face of both triumph and tragedy. The Mongol Empire's growth. The eastern end of the Central Asian steppes is the Mongols' traditional homeland. To the north are the forests of Siberia, while the Altai and Tian Shan mountains are to the west. To the east is the wooded Greater Khingan Range, and to the south is the Gobi Desert. A few rivers traverse Mongolia but need more direct access to the ocean or other major waterways. The climate can be harsh, with short summers and cold winters, and the steppe is located approximately 1 mile above sea level. The author of The Story of the Mongols Whom We Call Tartars, Giovanni di Plano Carpini, circa 1180 Senior 1252, an Italian priest from the 13th century, detailed the hardships he encountered while traveling from 1245 to 1247 to meet the great Khan Guyuk, d. 1248. There were frequent hailstorms and violent thunderstorms, and he wrote, "We had to throw ourselves flat to the ground because of the force of the wind, and there was so much dust we could hardly see." The steppes' climate, sandy soil, and irregular water supply made farming challenging for its inhabitants. They depended on the animals in their herd for necessities like clothing and food. With their flocks, the Mongols and their nomadic neighbors shifted between summer and winter grazing grounds. When they could not meet their needs through hunting and herding, they traded with the city people of China and Central Asia, who lived just outside the steppes. Other steppe peoples established their empires in Central Asia before the Mongols' ascent. In the 6th and 7th centuries, a significant portion of the area was under Turkish rule. The Turks referred to their ruler as Kagan and then Khan. Historian J. the Turks were the first barbarian nomads to establish a single empire across the steppes, according to J. Saunders, author of The History of the Mongol Conquests. Barbarians were members of a different race, viewed as primitive or uncultured. The lack of formal governments, education, and fine arts made the nomads appear barbarians to the world's sedentary population. The Turks were also the first barbarians to create a kingdom so extensive as to touch at different points the four great civilized societies of the day: China, India, Persia, and Byzantium. Saunders named the remnants of the former Roman Empire's eastern half Byzantium. Later, the Mongols would accomplish the same thing, and their empire's boundaries would extend well beyond the first strong Turkic state. A Turkic people, known as the Uyghurs, became the dominant force following the fall of the Turkic Empire in the middle of the 8th century. Their capital was located close to Karakorum, the future Mongol capital. The Uyghurs later influenced Mongol culture by creating political systems that the Mongols imitated, and using their alphabet to write Mongolian. The Khitans, who gained power in the early 10th century, then ruled over the tribes of Mongolia. The nomadic Khitans spoke a language resembling Mongolian. After capturing a portion of northern China, the Khitans brought Chinese culture to the Mongols. A tribe known as the Jurchen rebelled against the Khitans in 1115. The Jurchen were a subgroup of the Manchus who lived in northeastern China. Like the Chinese, they were farmers, but like the Mongols, they rode horses and kept livestock. The Mongols heavily influenced their language. Around 1120, the Jurchen overthrew the Khitans after years of rebellion. The Jurchen established the Jin dynasty as the new rulers of northern China. The Mongols separated from the Jurchen after they deposed the Khitan kings. Although independent chieftains emerged within Mongolia, they continued to acknowledge the Jurchen as their supreme rulers. The Mongols before Chinggis Khan. The Mongolian people lived as herders and largely isolated themselves during centuries of conflict in Central Asia. Among the tribes were the Mongols and other peoples with Turkic and Mongolian ancestry. The various tribes regularly married women from other tribes. This interaction formed the Turco-Mongolian culture. Outsiders who occasionally ruled the area also had an impact on the tribes. It's possible that the Mongols came to Mongolia from Syria's borders. The various Mongol clans, groups of close-knit families, had established tribes by the 12th century, each headed by a strong warrior. Although family ties were common among tribe members, an Anda bond was equally significant. In this relationship, two unrelated men feigned kinship and swore loyalty to each other. Men also chose to serve under specific leaders, willingly sacrificing their familial ties. We call a man who dedicates himself to a leader a nökör. The most powerful tribe in Mongolia was probably the Tatars, who formed alliances with the rulers of China's Jin dynasty. The two tribes frequently clashed because the Tatars were the Mongols' traditional enemies. The secret history of the Mongols, the only known Mongolian source for this period's history, still needs to be discovered. A Mongol chieftain named Yesugei killed a Tatar named Temujin during one of the 13 times they, the Mongols, joined battle with Tans, the Tatar. Then, as was customary, Yesugei named his newborn son after his deceased adversary. Despite deriving from Mongol aristocrats, Yesugei and his son Temujin's family did not wield much influence at his birth. Temujin became the leader of his tribe after his father passed away when he was 9 years old. The men who had served under him abandoned Yesugei because they did not want to follow a boy. Temujin and his family lived alone for many years, barely making ends meet. Finally, Temujin formed several significant alliances when he was 16. He began by enlisting other fighters to act as his nökörs. Then Temujin joined forces with Togril, d. 1203, the chief of the Mongolian Kerid tribe. Temujin's father and Togril had known each other before. Meanwhile, the Jin in China no longer held the Tatars in high esteem. The Kerids and Mongols vanquished the Tatars. Eventually, Temujin's forces also overcame the other Mongolian tribes. The chieftains called a Kuriltai, or meeting, in 1206. The Mongol rulers, who regarded Temujin as their supreme leader, named him Chinggis Khan. The election of Chinggis brought about a significant transformation in the Mongol Empire. The great Khan's demeanor and physical attributes awed his followers. Chinggis regarded obedience from his soldiers and loyalty among friends as extremely important. However, he also took advice and criticism from his closest advisors. This potent combination explains how Chinggis Khan built one of the world's greatest empires. Chinggis was adamant about using his military might to subjugate nearby territories. He believed the Mongolian deity, Eternal Heaven, also known as Teb-Tengeri, had chosen him to rule the world. The Mongols thought that numerous spirits controlled their herds, made hunting successful, and nearly everything else. But only Eternal Heaven gave them the authority to govern. They held that Khan was the sole ruler of heaven. Chinggis's military actions had political motivations as well. He insisted on handing over all refugees fleeing Mongol rule to the surrounding rulers. Protecting these refugees would turn the neighboring rulers into hostile nations. He also had to subjugate his neighbors to gain more riches and influence. Without it, he might lose the allegiance of the Mongol tribes that backed him. In 1209, Chinggis launched his first assault. The Mongols overran Jixia, located south of the Gobi Desert in present-day northwest China. The Tanguts, likely from Tibet, ruled this empire once it was a part of China. The Tangut kings swiftly consented to honor the Chinggis and submit to his authority rather than confront a stronger military force. Chinggis ruled over a crucial portion of the Silk Road, a vital trade route that connected Xixia and Mongolia. Additionally, he provided his troops with a western route to attack the Jin, the Mongols' principal eastern adversary. The Mongols invaded the northern Chinese region in 1211. The Mongols were initially satisfied with pillaging, stealing all the valuable goods in Jin cities before leaving for home. Eventually, however, they conquered the territories of their adversaries. In 1215, the Mongols overran Jin's north capital, Yanjing, now Beijing, forcing the Jin emperors to retreat south. The Jin persisted in fighting, despite that defeat. An additional 19 years passed during the Mongol War. The Mongols were almost invincible on the steppes' open plains. They could shoot arrows while riding their horses for days at a time. To surprise their adversaries, they depended on their quickness and self-control. Each of the 10 Migans had 1,000 soldiers, and they organized their army into tumans, or divisions of 10,000 soldiers. Each Meghan was in charge of 10 squadrons, also known as Jonsjaons, consisting of 100 men. To bring the tumans together at the appropriate moment and location for combat, Chinggis frequently had them travel separately. The Mongols were also extremely skilled warriors. Occasionally, while their main force was getting ready to attack from one direction, they pretended to attack from another. Chinggis had his men act like they were retreating to get their enemy to follow. The retreating forces would then lead the enemy into a position where the Mongols could easily defeat them. But the Mongols' typical cavalry was ineffective in densely populated cities. Soldiers mounted on horses. As a result, they had to use new war tactics in China. They received instruction in the art of siege warfare. Cutting a city off from the outside world to prevent it from receiving food supplies or new troops is known as siege warfare. The Mongols constructed siege engines, large machines intended to breach or scale city walls and other fortifications, using the expertise of Chinese engineers they had captured. These included large devices capable of launching rocks, flaming or explosive objects over high walls, and various types of catapults. By using siege engines to erode the city's defenses, the Mongols attempted to compel the inhabitants to surrender. For decades, the Mongols combined siege warfare with their cavalry attacks. One of the main reasons the Mongols became powerful was that they adopted siege warfare, which set them apart from other nomadic empires. Mongol warriors constructed war machines, like this early rocket launcher, using technology they had taken from China. In 1218, Chinggis focused on Karakitai, located west of the Altai Mountains. After Chinggis came to power, Kuchulug, d. 1218, a defeated tribal chieftain, fled from Mongolia to this region. Chinggis was concerned that Kuchulug might raise an army that would threaten the Mongols after he established control over Karakitai. About 20,000 Mongol soldiers invaded Karachitai. Because Kuchulug had killed a local prince and restricted the practice of Islam, the predominant religion in that region, the people welcomed them. The Mongols swiftly took control of Karachitai. Khwarezm, a Muslim empire extending from the Caspian Sea to Transoxiana and south into Afghanistan, was now on the border of the expanding Mongol Empire. Sultan Muhammad was in charge of it, alternatively known as Khwarezm Shah, d. 1220. He declined to punish a Khwarezmian governor in 1218 for the murder of hundreds of Mongol traders. The governor thought there were spies on the merchants' trading expedition. This was probably because Chinggis was interested in his neighbor's military prowess and shortcomings. After surviving the assault, one Mongol returned to Chinggis. Subsequently, the irate Great Khan dispatched 3 emissaries to Sultan Muhammad, urging him to hold the governor accountable for the massacre. After refusing, the Khwarezmian ruler killed one of the ambassadors. Paul Rachnevsky cited Chinggis's statement that the Khwarezm Shah is no king. He is a bandit, an outlaw in Genghis Khan, his life and legacy. The Great Khan prepared his army for their first significant conflict in the West. By the spring of 1219, the Chinggis had amassed an army of roughly 200,000 soldiers. His forces included the Karluks, an ethnic group from Karakitai, and Uyghurs. He divided the army into 3 major groups. Muslim Turks and Persians made up the Khwarezmians' larger army. Sultan Muhammad needed to figure out how to deal with this triple threat, so he wanted to avoid facing the Mongols in the open. The Khwarezmian king also questioned his soldiers' loyalty. Most of these mercenary troops relied on the Turks and Persians to collaborate more effectively within the army. Trusting Sultan Muhammad's army to follow his orders was crucial. The Sultan kept his army in different cities throughout the empire to avoid direct combat. They became simple prey for the Mongols. Before moving on to the capital of Samarkand, Chinggis and his youngest son, Tolui, 1193–1233, led the assault on the important city of Bukhara. The Mongols killed hundreds of thousands of Khwarezm soldiers and civilians in what was arguably one of the bloodiest wars in history. Historians of the time estimated that millions of people died. According to Ibn al-Athir, 1160–1233, an Arab historian, a tremendous disaster such as this had never happened before, as cited by David Morgan in The Mongols. Until the end of time, the world may not experience anything like it again. Most contemporary historians question the high death toll reported in traditional sources. The brutality of the Khwarezm conquest is still undeniable. The Mongols massacred thousands of Khwarezmian soldiers, demolished the defensive walls, and stole everything of value they could find in each city. It is your leaders who have committed these crimes, and I am the punishment of God, Chinggis declared to the people of Bukhara, as James Chambers writes in The Devil's Horseman. Two Mongol generals, Subedai, 1176-1248, and Jebe, D. Sikar, 1225, chased Sultan Muhammad's son in 1221 as he escaped the oncoming enemy. The generals explored some of the Russian steppes, but failed to apprehend him. The Mongols crossed the Sea of Azov and the Volga River north through Georgia to Russia. Eventually, along the Jaxartes River on the eastern border of Khwarezm, Jebe and Subedai encountered the main Mongol army. The Chinggis vanquished the Khwarezmians by 1223, and they were gradually returning to Mongolia. The Great Khan II. Because the Tanguts of Sixia rebelled against Mongol rule, Chinggis Khan led a second attack against them in 1226. Despite the campaign's success, Chinggis passed away in 1227. Mongolia buried him near the Onon and Kerelen rivers. Ögedei, the third son of Chinggis, was chosen by the Mongol chieftains to be the new Great Khan 2 years later. The land known as Ulus was given to Ögedei's brothers and nephews, the sons of his deceased brother Jochi, who were in charge of it. Tolui inherited the traditional Mongol homelands. Chagatai ruled over Transoxiana and neighboring Central Asian territories. Jochi's sons, Orda and Batu, inherited the steppes of what is now southern Russia, even though the western portion of this region was not yet under Mongol rule. Chinggis believed that eternal heaven had granted him and his family complete control over the world. The Chinggis expected to rule the world in the end. As Great Khan, Ögedei ruled the empire and oversaw his Ulus, which included portions of China and Russia. The empire also granted a small Ulus to Chinggis's brothers in the northeastern region. A Kuriltai confirmed Gedei's status as the second Great Khan in 1229. He directed the Mongols' military power toward the Jin in China in less than 2 years. The secret history of the Mongols claims that the Mongols assaulted Solj. Across their towns and cities in every quarter, and pillaged Jin's gold and silver, satins having gold and having patterns, possessions, alias horses, and little slaves. By 1234, the Jin dynasty had lost control of the region to Mongol rule. Ögedei convened a gathering of his nökers and relatives in Karakorum, the new Mongol capital, in 1235. The Mongols were getting ready to engage in combat on multiple fronts. Chagatai sought to increase Mongol authority over the areas in the southwest that the Chinggis had taken over nearly 15 years prior. Gedei sought to extend the empire into China's Song dynasty-ruled regions in the east. General Subedai endorsed Batu's request for a fresh campaign in Russia that might eventually lead the Mongols into Europe. The Mongols' next significant military operation was their advance into the steppes of Russia. Batu and Subedai led the campaign, with Subedai contributing most of the strategy. With Ögedei's assistance, Batu gathered his army in the spring of 1236. Several Chinggis's grandsons were among the commanders, including Tolui's son Munka, Ögedei's son Guyuk, c. 1206-1248, and Batu's brother Berka, d. 1266. Eventually, the army numbered roughly 150,000 soldiers, comprising Turks, Mongols, and other inhabitants of the empire. Engineers from China and Persia created siege engines and other military hardware. The Volga River's inhabitants were the Mongols' first targets. While Munki attacked the Kipchak nomads, a Turkic people who inhabited the steppes from Kazakhstan to Romania, Subedai's army destroyed the Bulgars. When the Mongols took the Kipchak ruler prisoner, he refused to submit to Munka. The Mongol prince then divided the ruler's body. Batu and his golden horde occasionally referred to the territories they ruled as the Kipchak Khanate. The Mongol Khanate in the western part of the Mongol Empire was known to the Russians as the Golden Horde, after the Mongol invasion of Russia. Batu concentrated his army in the old Kipchak homeland. He established Sarai, his capital, close to now Leninsk, Russia. The Mongols threatened several tiny, princely states in Russia. Ryazan was the first principality to collapse. The Mongols were particularly cruel inside the city. They left some residents to perish after spearing them with large wooden stakes and amputating one prince's limbs. J.J. Saunders, in the History of the Mongol Conquests, quotes a Russian author who recounts similar brutality in nearby Kolomna, where no eye remained open to weep for the dead. The Mongols hoped that when the other Russian principalities heard about their violence, they would surrender without a fight. However, some of the princes were ready to fight the Mongols. Despite resistance from important cities like Suzdal, Vladimir, and Kiev, the Mongols swept through them as they marched west. The sounds of marching animals and yelling soldiers filled the air as the Mongols advanced, accompanied by the rhythm of drummers on camels. The Russian princes' reluctance to band together against the superior army of their common enemy was a major issue. The governing princes frequently quarreled and fought for dominance. These arguments continued despite the threat of defeat. By the winter of 1240, the Mongols had taken control of the Russian cities. The Mongols completely destroyed some Russian cities and their inhabitants. However, some contemporary historians claim that some Russian cities either escaped the Mongol assault or managed to rebuild soon after the Mongols left. Carpini wrote in his account of the Mongols that he passed through Kiev several years after the Mongol invasion and found it reduced to almost nothing. The priest also reported seeing countless human skulls and bones from the dead scattered over the field. Several factors contributed to the Mongols' military triumph. The generals still employed the cavalry and siege warfare strategies Chinggis had established during his conquests. They compelled the defeated peoples to provide soldiers, enabling them to sustain a substantial army. The Mongol culture also highly valued archery, using a bow and arrow, and horseback riding, as these skills transferred from the hunting field to the battlefield. Mongol boys learned to ride a horse almost immediately after learning to walk. The Khan anticipated they would fight under his direction once they were 20. They had mastered the art of shooting from a horse by that time. A Mongol soldier carried a larger bow for long-range shooting and a smaller one for close quarters. He had at least 60 arrows too. A warrior could shoot an arrow over 350 yards with his larger bow. The Mongols employed both light and heavy cavalry. The light cavalry typically wore leather armor, but some wore lighter or no armor. The heavy cavalry wore a metal protective suit, leather and mail. To protect themselves from the light, the soldiers also wore leather helmets. The heavy cavalry used iron. Every soldier carried a leather and wicker shield. They also kept necessary items like food, extra clothes, and tools for fixing their weapons in their saddlebags. The horse was the Mongol soldier's constant companion. Before the Mongols came to Central Asia, the steppe had tamed wild horses and carefully bred them to be strong enough to support a rider. Around 400 CE, the Chinese created the stirrup, rings fastened to a saddle where a rider places his feet, which quickly spread to Asian steppe people. That small invention made it easier for riders to use their hands during combat by allowing them to remain on their horses without using them. The Mongols were masters of cavalry warfare, and their culture highly prized horses. Each soldier owned multiple horses to ensure they had a new one for the lengthy treks across the steppe. Typically, the Mongols rode castrated male horses called geldings. It was considered unmanly to ride a mare or female horse. In times of need, a soldier would ride his horse, nick its skin, and then drink some of its blood. The Mongols were able to feed themselves in this manner without wasting time. Geographers typically use the Ural Mountains to delineate the border between Asia and Europe. This indicates that the Mongols expanded their empire to include Europe by invading Russia. The westward push, however, had continued. By the end of 1240, the Mongols were ready to cross the Carpathian Mountains and enter Hungary. Batu and Sube'etei led this advance. In the meantime, two of Chinggis Khan's grandsons, Baydar, dates unknown, and Kardan, dates unknown, advanced into Poland with a smaller army. The northern Mongol army began attacking Polish cities in early 1241 after crossing the frozen Vistula River. To facilitate Sube'etei's attack, this army attempted to entice European forces to leave Hungary. Baydar swept Krakow, the Polish capital at the time. The Mongols burned the city, and the inhabitants had already left. The Mongols traversed Poland, reaching as far as Liegnitz and crossing the Oder River. The Mongols chopped off the ears of their vanquished adversary at the battle outside that city, stealing enough to fill 9 bags. After that, Baydar and Kaden headed south to Hungary to join the Mongol army. In April 1241, 4 Hungarian armies attacked the Mongols. They soon reached the towns of Buda and Pest. Budapest, the capital of Hungary, now unites these towns into a single city along the Danube River. The Mongols then prepared to travel to Zagreb, the capital of present-day Croatia, while they sent an advance party into Austria. Even Western European leaders feared being conquered by the Mongols. Europeans were aware of the Mongols' extreme brutality by the end of 1241. Even though the reports inflated and contained lies, such as the idea that the Mongol soldiers were consuming the flesh of their fallen foes, the truth was severe enough. The Mongols, however, never advanced further into Europe. Batu discovered the death of Ögedei early in 1242. To select the next great Khan, Batu had to travel back to Karakorum with the Khan's family and other significant figures. To attend the Kuriltai that would select the next great Khan, Batu assembled his army in Hungary and embarked on the arduous journey back to Mongolia. The Mongols retreated for other reasons. The descendants of Chinggis occasionally quarreled with one another, and Central Europe lacked the pastures they required to feed their horses. There was no common goal among them. They had already achieved one of their main goals. Bela, 1206-1270, the king of Hungary, had infuriated the Mongols by defending the Cumans, whom the Mongols had vanquished in the 1220s. The Mongol mission in Europe ended with Bela's defeat. The Europeans were pleased to see the Mongols go, regardless of the reason. Because they eliminated the threat they posed in Eastern and Central Europe, the Mongols never launched a significant invasion there again. The descendants of Chinggis took 4 years to decide who would be their next leader. By an ancient Mongol tradition, Ögedei's wife, Torigen, d. Shaima 1246, held the position of regent or temporary ruler during that period. Shirman, d. December 1251, Ögedei's grandson, was to succeed him as the great Khan. However, his wife gave preference to Guyuk, their son. Batu, who had argued with Guyuk during the Russian campaign, opposed Torigen's efforts to elect her son. Karpini arrived in Karakorum after Guyuk's election as Great Khan in 1246. The Italian priest noted that Mongol princes and ambassadors from various countries honored Guyuk with amazing gifts. Karpini said a certain provincial governor gave him camels, armored horses, and mules. The emperor and his nobles divided gold, silver, and silk garments from over 50 wagons parked over the hill. Tensions between cousins Guyuk and Batu persisted after the celebrations of that day. In 1247, the Great Khan was about to attack Batu's army. Tolui's wife, Sorkhaghtani Beki, d. 1252, alerted Batu to Guyuk's approach, but the civil war never broke out, and Guyuk passed away in 1248 before he could attack Batu. During the 3 years, Guyuk's wife, Oghul Kaimish, served as regent. Sorkhaghtani desired one of her sons to succeed him. So she teamed up with Batu, who wanted to avoid becoming Great Khan. Together, they persuaded the Mongol princes in 1251 to select her son Mungke as the next Mongol ruler. From Tolui's branch of Chinggis's family, all the great Khans descended for the next century. But the family strife was far from over. Mungke won the election at a Kuriltai outside of Mongolia, and the families of Ögedei and Chagatai argued that the election was invalid because it had not taken place in their ancestral homelands, and these relatives fought Mungke and his supporters for control of the empire. Mungke won the power struggle and imprisoned important commanders who supported the Ögedei and Chagatai families. His grandson Shiramun was also executed for his role in the uprising. His brother Hulegu assumed command of a large army composed primarily of foreigners, including Chinese engineers and weapons specialists, whose crude flamethrowers ignited a chemical called naphtha, which burned anything it came into contact with. By this time, the Mongols were using gunpowder to fire arrows out of tubes, and the Chinese had also invented the first crude step toward modern rockets. Mungke's initial objective was to increase and fortify Mongol control in the Islamic lands of Southwest Asia. In 1256, Hulegu's army crossed the Oxus River and attacked Ismaili castles in Iran and Afghanistan. The Ismailis were radical Shiites, one of the two major groups in Islam, the other being Sunni, and they adhered to their own Shiite beliefs. The Sunnis deemed the Ismailis so deviant from the mainstream religion that they sentenced them to death, which the Ismailis saw as a justifiable means of self-defense. Therefore, other Muslims were afraid of the Ismailis. According to one account, a Muslim religious leader actually requested that the Mongols attack them. William of Rubruck, a Christian priest who traveled to Mongol lands, asserted that Hulegu's attack in 1256 followed a failed Ismaili plot to assassinate the Great Khan. Ad-Din, d. Shana 1257, was the Grand Master, or leader of the Ismailis, who, fearing the power of the Mongols, surrendered to Hulegu after a brief siege and persuaded other Ismailis to surrender without resistance. Rukn ad-Din pleaded with Hulegu to spare his life and allow him to meet Mungke, and the Mongol general complied. However, the Mongol guards killed ad-Din and his family when the Great Khan refused to meet him. After that, Hulegu's army moved west toward Baghdad, which had been a hub of Islamic politics and culture for centuries in what is now Iraq. A caliph, a powerful religious and political figure, governed the city, serving as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, or kingdom, established in 750 and ruling an empire at its peak from North Africa to Afghanistan. The caliph in 1257 was Mustasim, d. 1258, whom historian J.J. Saunders describes as weak, vain, incompetent, and cowardly in the history of the Mongol conquests. Hulegu suggested that Mustasim accept Mongol rule and refrain from slaughter, but the caliph refused, insulted the Mongol commander, and ordered him to leave. Instead, Hulegu led troops from the Golden Horde in a typical Mongol attack from multiple directions, and Mustasim surrendered early in 1258, after which the Mongols pillaged Baghdad. After a year in Baghdad, Hulegu prepared to travel west again, this time to Egypt, under the rule of the Mamluks, Turkish warriors who had overthrown the local caliph. By this point, some Christian rulers who had been fighting the Muslims in the Middle East had welcomed the Mongols. A few decades before, The Mongols had been their enemies when they invaded Europe, but now the Christian rulers of Europe were engaged in a series of wars known as the Crusades to drive the Muslims from the Holy Land, the area where Jesus Christ lived and died, in what is now the Middle East. There were only a few Christian troops left in the area when the Mongols arrived. Some joined the Mongols in their fight against the Syrian Muslims, while others refused to join them, even against their fiercest foe, because the Mongols were not Christian. When the Mamluks attacked and defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in present-day Israel in September 1260, the Mongols appeared ready to take over Syria permanently after capturing the Syrian cities of Aleppo and Damascus. Upon learning of Mongol's death in 1259, he withdrew some of his forces back into Persia, bringing the Mongol army to a state of partial strength. This required Hulagu to return to Karakoram for the Kuriltai to select the next great Khan. Though Hulagu acknowledged that the lack of grazing lands for their horses would make it difficult to maintain a Mongol presence in the Middle East, the circumstances were similar to those of 1241, when the Mongol push into Europe had been halted by the death of Ögedei. Nevertheless, the Mongols would attempt to retake Syria multiple times over the following decades. Hulagu fought in the west, but Mongke concentrated on expanding Mongol control over southern China, sending his brother Kubilai, c. 1294, to fight in areas that bordered Song dynasty territory. Kubilai's campaign started in 1252, and he and Mongke led the Mongol armies that invaded southern China in 1258. By this point, his brother Kubilai had become China's most powerful Mongol ruler, and Mongke allowed him to rule over a portion of the country. Kubilai established a capital in Kaiping, now known as Shangdu, which means upper capital in Chinese, and was located in what is now Inner Mongolia, some 125 miles northwest of Beijing. Berk, the new leader of the Golden Horde, favored Arik Börke for Great Khan, as did many of Chagatai's and Ögedei's descendants. In 1259, Mongke died of disease-induced fever after a battle, and Kubilai and another brother Arik Börke, d. 1266, fought for the title of Great Khan. Mongol princes, who had stayed in the traditional Mongol homelands, backed Börke because they were suspicious of the substantial influence of Chinese culture on Kubilai. The principal supporters of Kubilai were his brother Hulagu and the Mongol princes in China, who voted for Kubilai at a Kuriltai in Shangdu in May 1260. Arik Börke and his supporters protested the lack of an election in the Mongolian homelands, and in June, he declared himself Great Khan, igniting another civil war. While Kubilai fought the Song in Ezhu, present-day Wuhan, along the Yangtze River, Arik Börke chose generals to raise forces north and south of the Gobi Desert. These forces made their way to Shangdu. Kubilai had to leave Ezhu and return to Shangdu to defend his capital, as the Arik Börke army approached. By promising Kubilai that he would not attack, Arik Börke attempted to deceive his older brother, but at the time, he was strengthening his military with the assistance of a cousin, Kubilai. Cut off the supply line to Arik Börke's forces, which made it difficult for them to fight. Arik Börke was adamant about facing Kubilai. The two brothers' armies clashed at the end 1261 along the Chinese-Mongol border, and neither side could declare a decisive victory. After that, Arik Börke went to Central Asia to find allies, which allowed Kubilai to seize total control of Mongolia. Despite his occasional victories, he could not compete with Kubilai's better-equipped army, and in 1264, he finally accepted his brother's rule as Great Khan. Kubilai then killed some of the Mongols who had backed him, but he did not execute his brother. In 1265, he called a Kuriltai to decide on the proper punishment for Arik Börke's civil war. However, Arik Böke passed away in 1266 before the Mongols could meet. Historians conjecture that he might have succumbed to poisoning, yet the evidence remains ambiguous. From that moment on, Kubilai was undisputed as the Great Khan, with the support of the Mongol rulers in Persia and direct authority over only China, Tibet, and Korea. Following his victory over Arik Böke, Kubilai Khan focused on defeating the Song and establishing his authority over China. He also enhanced his reputation with family members and other princes who questioned his legitimacy as the Great Khan and persuaded his subjects that he deserved to lead their magnificent civilization. Kubilai had two reasons for invading Song territory. The southern area had better agricultural land than the northern area, which could supply food for the empire. It had ports that could facilitate international trade. Kubilai feared that if he did not unite China under his control, the Song would eventually muster an army and attempt to overthrow their foreign overlords. When fighting in the south, the Mongol army had never dealt with the hot, humid weather, accompanied by jungles, forests, and farmlands. The Song had a strong navy, and the Mongols had to build their own ships to defeat them, with assistance from the Chinese already under their control. The battle occurred in northern China's cold, dry, open steppes, while the south had few open fields for the Mongols' horses to graze. Kubilai first sent a delegation to ask the Song emperor to recognize his authority, submit, and avoid war, but the Song emperor refused. Small battles began to occur along the Song-Mongol-China border in the early 1260s, and the Mongols won the first major battle in the province of Sichuan in 1265. Despite this, the Song were adamant about maintaining their independence, and the war continued for more than 10 years. The Mongols besieged several cities, including Xianyang, where they used thousands of boats to engage in a 2-year siege on the Yellow River. In 1276, the Mongols captured Hangzhou, the Song capital, and within 3 years, they had total control over southern China. Kubilai formally declared himself Emperor of China during these war years, and he gave his dynasty a Chinese name, Yuan, which means the origin. He ruled over roughly 65 million Chinese people, while the Mongol population numbered only a few million. Kubilai, a Mongol, sought to alter the perception of barbarians by assimilating Chinese customs and habits. Previously, civil servants had to pass an examination to fill most government positions. Under the Great Khan, this system ensured that the best people worked in the government, regardless of who was in charge. The civil service examination primarily assessed one's understanding of the theories of one of China's greatest thinkers, Confucius, c. 551-479 BCE. On the other hand, the Great Khan did not trust Confucius's adherents, who controlled Chinese politics, and was more concerned with choosing government employees who would serve him. Kubilai gave many high-level positions to foreigners, while Chinese people held lower-level positions in the government. Even before he completely controlled China, Kubilai looked to further East Asian conquests. His first concern was Korea, which the Chinggis had invaded in 1218. Chinggis forced the Koreans to pay tribute to him, but they stopped a few years later. The Mongols invaded Korea again in 1231, but the country did not come under firm Mongol control until the end of Mengke's reign in 1258. Kubilai formed favorable relations with the Korean king, Wonjong, r. 1259 to 1274, who ruled with the Mongols' permission. So when several Korean military leaders rebelled in 1269, Kubilai sent troops to aid the king. By the following year, Korea was completely under the control of the Yuan dynasty. However, Wonjong remained on the throne, and his son married one of Kubilai's daughters. In 1273, as the war with the Song went on, Kublai ordered some of his forces to Japan. For years, he had been sending ambassadors there. He demanded that the Japanese pay him tribute as the Emperor of China and the Great Khan of the Mongols. The Japanese, however, always refused. In 1274, a Mongol fleet of about 800 boats sailed for Japan, carrying an invasion force of more than 30,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers and sailors. In the first battle on the island of Kyushu, the Mongols won a decisive victory. But a severe storm forced their soldiers to return to their ships. The navy then sailed into open seas to escape damage from the fierce winds. That turned out to be a disastrous decision. Kublai was still trying to remember the Japanese, though. He sent an even larger army to Japan in 1281. The Japanese fought well this time, and another damaging storm forced the Mongols to retreat. After this second attempt, Japan never faced another Mongol threat. Kublai and his forces were more successful in Southeast Asia. In 1277, a Mongol army invaded the Kingdom of Pagan in what is now Myanmar, formerly called Burma. The pagans rode elephants into battle. The Mongol general ordered his archers to shoot at the animals, not the riders. The Italian explorer Marco Polo described the scene in the Description of the World, stating that the elephants suffered injuries on all sides of their bodies and were terrified by the loud shouts. The terrified animals ran toward the Burmese troops, putting the army of the king into the greatest confusion. Although the Mongols won, their victory led to limited control over Pagan. Kublai sent more troops there during the 1280s, forcing the kingdom to pay tribute. Mongol influence also reached what is now Vietnam and parts of Indonesia. The Mongol army fought several battles with two Vietnamese kingdoms, Annam and Champa. For a time, the kings of the two Vietnamese kingdoms paid tribute, but Kublai never had direct control over their lands. The Mongols also invaded the Indonesian island of Java in 1292. The invasion, like the earlier attacks on Japan, ended in failure. Kublai focused most of his attention and military might on East Asia, but he did not overlook the western part of his empire. There, rebellion and outside threats troubled his rule. The region of Tibet, which includes modern Tibet and parts of Qinghai and Sichuan. Provinces in China had been under Mongol influence since the late 1240s. During the 1280s, Tibetans rebelled against the leader Kublai had chosen for them. The Great Khan sent in soldiers who killed about 10,000 Tibetans while squashing the rebellion. One of Kublai's concerns about the Tibetan rebels was their tie to an old enemy, his cousin Kaidu, 1236 to 1301. Kaidu was a grandson of the Great Khan Ögedei. He established his base near Lake Balkhash, east of Transoxiana, and part of the Chagatai Khanate. Kaidu eventually made a deal with the Golden Horde Mongols and Barak, d. 1271. Barak was a great-grandson of Chagatai, who ruled the family Zulus. The arrangement between Kaidu and Barak gave Kaidu control of large parts of the Chagatai Ulus. Eventually, Kaidu was powerful enough to choose the Khan who ruled that Ulus. With his growing power, Kaidu repeatedly challenged Kublai in the western part of his Khanate. For several years, Kaidu let Chagatai princes under his control do most of the fighting. These Central Asian Mongols fought small battles against troops led by Nomu Khan, d. Chaita 1292, Kublai's son. In 1276, some of the commanders under Nomu Khan plotted against him. They kidnapped the Mongol prince, his brother, and his cousin, bringing Nomu Khan and his brother to the Khan of the Golden Horde, and their cousin to Kaidu. Although he welcomed the action, Kaidu did not actively participate in the plot. The kidnapping added to Kubilai's troubles in the region. Rebels in Mongolia perceived him as weak in his empire's western part. In 1277, the rebels looted Karakorum, the old Mongol capital. Kubilai had to send troops to end the rebellion. Some of the escaping rebels later joined forces with Kaidu. The major conflict between Kaidu and Kubilai began in 1286. Kaidu seized the city of Beshbali, south of the Altai Mountains. The next year, a Mongol prince named Nayan, d. 1287, led a rebellion in Manchuria, a region in northern China. He and Kaidu were working together, and Kaidu took advantage of the revolt to invade western Mongolia. Kubilai personally led the campaign against Nayan, which ended with the rebels' capture and execution. In the Travels of Marco Polo observed the battle and wrote, "If God had thundered, you would not have heard the cries that arose from the crowds of the wounded and the dying." Nayan's death did not end Kaidu's fight against Kubilai. Kaidu continued advancing into Mongolia for several years, until he died in 1301. By then, Kubilai was already dead, and the title of Great Khan had passed on to his grandson, Temur Ölgetu. For a time under Temur Ölgetu's rule, the conflicts between the various khanates ended, and Mongol China began a peaceful period that lasted several decades. The development of the Il-Khanate. Only in the 1250s was Mongol control in eastern Persia, and surrounding lands complete, because some local rulers still held power. Chinggis had won important victories in Khwarezm and Khorasan, a region in Iran. But Hulagu's campaign in 1256 truly brought the region into the Mongol Empire. The first Khan of the Ilkhanate was Hulagu. The name is a Mongol word meaning controlled or not rebellious. It reflected that Hulagu accepted Kubilai as the great Khan and would not challenge his authority. Hulagu's Khanate stretched from the Oxus River and the Hindu Kush to Anatolia, now a major part of modern Turkey. The Ilkhanate's southern border was the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. The Ulus of the Golden Horde lay to the north of the Ilkhanate. Some modern nations within the Ilkhanate's borders are Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Iraq, and parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkmenistan. While ruling the Ilkhanate, Hulagu faced problems on several sides. One of his enemies was his cousin Berke, the third Khan of the Golden Horde. Berke did not support Kubilai's election as the Great Khan. This placed him and Hulagu on opposite sides of the Chinggis family. The two cousins also had a border dispute over Azerbaijan. Ultimately, Berke converted to Islam, and he took issue with Hulagu's tolerance toward Christians and other non-Muslims. Berke joined the Mamluks of Egypt in an alliance against the Ilkhanate. In 1262, Berke and the Mamluks attacked Hulagu on two sides. The Mamluk leader Baybars, in 1233-1277, engaged in combat with Christians, allied with Hulagu in Syria and Armenia. Berke's forces invaded Hulagu's lands in Georgia and Azerbaijan. The two sides also fought in southern Russia. In 1263, the Golden Horde won a major victory at the Terek River. The ice on the river gave way, causing the retreating forces from the Ilkhanate to drown. The loss, however, made Hulagu decide to launch a major attack the following year. However, a rebellion in his empire delayed the attack, and Hulagu died in 1265 before he could lead the army against his cousin. Seeking a Western alliance in 1262, Hulagu tried to contact leaders in Western Europe. He was looking for allies against the Mamluks and the Golden Horde. A letter that he wrote to King Louis IX of France survives. Hulagu also sent diplomats to Italy. Abaga, d. 1282, Hulagu's son and the second Ilkhan, continued these efforts to find allies in the West. Letters from him reached Pope Urban IV, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and King Edward I of England. Abaga also signed a trade treaty with Venice, whose merchants sold goods at trading posts along the Black Sea. Politically, however, the Mongol effort to win Western allies failed. No European leader sent troops to help Abaga fight the Mamluks. Hulagu's son Abaga then took command, and two major Mongol armies prepared to go to war. The war never fully developed, though. Berka died in 1266. The next Khan of the Golden Horde, Mungka Temür, d. 1280, decided not to continue the struggle with the Ilkhanate. Soon after one struggle with a relative ended, Abaga faced a new threat from another family member. Barak, from the Chagatai Ulus, attacked the eastern borders of the Ilkhanate. In 1269, he took over part of Khorasan. Abaga eventually pushed the invaders out of his realm and carried the counterattack into Transoxiana. Around the same time, Baybars attacked Antioch in Syria and invaded Armenia. In 1277, he fought Mongol forces in Anatolia and Lesser Armenia, a Christian kingdom allied with the Ilkhanate. Today, this area is part of Turkey. Abaga launched a successful counterattack, but the Mamluks continued to threaten the western edges of his lands. In 1281, Abaga led a major invasion of Syria. He hoped to defeat the Mamluks and extend Mongol rule as far west as Egypt, something his father never achieved. Once again, however, the Mamluks pushed back the Mongols. Unrest in the Ilkhanate. Abaga died after the failed invasion of Syria. In 1282, his brother Teg Uda, d. 1284, emerged as the next Ilkhan. Abaga had wanted his son Arghun, Sikra 1258-1291, to take over, but Teg Uda prevented that. Teg Uda converted to Islam and tried to establish an alliance with the Muslims of Egypt. But before he could make the Ilkhanate an Islamic state, Arghun and some Mongol princes loyal to him assassinated Teguder. Historian Paul D. Buell, in his historical dictionary of the Mongol World Empire, writes that Arghun's rule began with a bloodbath. The new Ilkhan and his supporters killed the officials who had supported Teguder. For most of Arghun's reign, his empire was at peace. But like his father and grandfather, he was determined to capture Syria and destroy the Mamluks. And like them, he reached out to the west, hoping to unite Mongol and Christian armies against the Muslims. He wrote letters, dispatched diplomats, and once pledged to supply 30,000 horses for Christian soldiers to use in Syria. The Ilkhan, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, stated in a letter to Pope Honorius, Frothdor, Sikra 1287, as quoted by J.A. Boyle in the Cambridge History of Iran, "We from this side, and you from your side, shall crush Egypt between us with good men." Arghun never developed a wartime alliance. He strengthened his business ties with the West. In 1288, he signed a contract with merchants from Genoa, Italy, similar to the one his father had signed with Venice. Arghun died in 1291, and the Ilkhanate entered an unstable period. The Ilkhan had not named his successor, so his brother, Gekhatu, Securus 1271 to 1295, took power the next year. He spent money lavishly and soon ran into financial trouble. Within 4 years, rebels led by Baidu, d. 1295, a grandson of Hulegu, strangled Gekhatu. Baidu then claimed the title of Ilkhan. Almost immediately, Arghun's son, Ghazan, 1271-1304, challenged Baidu's authority. Despite initially being a Buddhist, Ghazan took the advice of one of Baidu's generals and converted to Islam. This made him popular with many of the local people. By the end of 1295, Ghazan had won enough support to force out Baidu and become the next Ilkhan. Under Ghazan, the Ilkhanate reached its cultural and economic peak. J.A. Boyle, in the Cambridge History of Iran, calls him, without question, the greatest of the Ilkhans, a remarkably gifted man by the standards of any age. Ghazan promoted the arts and education and built many grand public buildings. He also continued reforms that had begun under Arghun to create a centralized tax system. Historians still debate the number of reforms he implemented, but he made every effort to enhance the government. Through his actions, Ghazan showed two sides. He tried to make life easier and fairer for the common people. He prohibited Mongol officials from beating and killing peasant wives and children, a tactic the Mongols had previously employed to persuade citizens to pay taxes. Yet, at times, Ghazan could be cruel as he enforced the laws of his land. Official records show that in just 1 month, he executed 43 high-ranking officials, including some Mongol princes. During Ghazan's reign, more Mongols began to convert to Islam. Ghazan's reign began with a wave of persecution against Christians and Buddhists, but he later stopped forcing people to convert to Islam. Some Mongols also gave up their nomadic lifestyle and began marrying local peoples, especially the Turks. The distinct Mongol culture began to blend with the native Turkic and Persian cultures. This process continued for decades. Ghazan, however, always remained proud of his Mongol heritage and family ties to Chinggis Khan. He studied his family's history and rule and continued to respect the authority of Temür, Kublai Khan's successor in China. Following Mongol tradition, Ghazan looked beyond his borders for lands to conquer. First on the list was Mamluk Syria. The Ilkhanate managed to take over the city of Aleppo in 1299. A second invasion in 1303 ended horribly for the Mongols. Following their defeat, the Mamluks forced the Mongol prisoners to march through Cairo. Around their necks, they carried the heads of other Mongols, which the Mamluks had chopped off. Ghazan died the following year. He never fulfilled the Mongol dream of spreading the empire to Egypt. The end of his rule also marked the end of a strong Mongol presence in the Ilkhanate. The region would take on greater Persian and Muslim influence in the future. The Golden Horse. Of the three Khanates beyond the Mongols' homeland in East Asia, the Golden Horde had the least contact with the Great Khan. They were the farthest away, and Mongke and Kubilai focused more on China than other parts of the realm. The Mongols called it the Kipchak Khanate. It had fewer Mongols than the other Ulus. It also had fewer officials who reported to the Great Khan, giving the local Khans greater independence. The Golden Horde's capital was Sarai, along the Volga River and not far from the Caspian Sea. The Mongols had direct control over most of the region near the Volga, the southern steppes of Russia, and lands north of the Caucasus Mountains, which run between the Black and Caspian Seas. The Ulus also spread to parts of Siberia and what is now Kazakhstan. The Khans of the Golden Horde also had indirect control over northwest Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. The first Kipchak Khan, Batu, used his power to convince some Russian princes to surrender without a fight. He sent Prince Alexander Nevsky, 1220-1263, this message, as quoted by John Lawrence in A. God has subdued many nations to me. Dost thou alone refuse to submit to my power? But if you want to maintain your lands, come to me. Nevsky and the other Russian princes sent the Mongols tribute to keep their local authority. Some of the Golden Horde's conflicts with the rest of the Mongol Empire arose over the selection of new Great Khans. Batu accepted Mongke as the Great Khan, but his brother Berke refused to back Kubilai's election in 1260. Berke also fought with the Ilkhanate, his neighbor to the southwest. Following their wars with the Ilkhans, Berke and his successors allied with Egypt's Mamluks, the Ilkhanate's main enemy. That friendship made the Golden Horde and the Mamluks trading partners and military allies. Contact with the Turkic rulers of Egypt also strengthened Turkic culture among the Golden Horde elite. The Mongols in Russia did not absorb local culture, as the Mongols did in Persia and China. They isolated themselves on the steppes and followed the traditional nomadic culture as much as possible. The rise of Nogai. Starting in the 1260s, a Mongol prince named Nogai, d. 1299, gained considerable power within the Golden Horde. He was the nephew of Berk, and in 1259 he led a Mongol army into Poland. The advance was a brief detour from a campaign against rebels on the western edge of the Khanate. 6 years later, Nogai led a larger force into Bulgaria, a country north of modern Greece and Turkey. Berke was responding to a plea for help from the Bulgarians. They faced the Antine Empire in the south, based in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, in Turkey. The Byzantine Empire had once been a major force in Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East, although its power was declining. The Mongols of Russia sometimes came into conflict with the Byzantine Empire as they competed with it to influence smaller countries in the region. Because of this animosity, the Mongols agreed to help the Bulgarians. Nogai forced the Byzantine troops out of Bulgaria. He eventually married a member of the Byzantine royal family, a sign that the Byzantines wanted an alliance with the Mongols rather than continue fighting. Nogai eventually became a so-called kingmaker. He never ruled as Khan of the Golden Horde, but chose who held that title and influenced key government decisions. In 1265, Nogai and Berke attacked Ilkhanate territory, hoping to win control of Azerbaijan and Georgia. In a battle in 1266, the Khan met his demise, and Nogai suffered an eye injury. The new Khan was Mungke Temür, who was either the son or grandson of Batu. The records are not clear. The new leader of the Golden Horde ended the war with the Ilkhanate. He also maintained the Golden Horde's independence from Kubilai Khan by supporting the Great Khan's enemy, Kaidu, in Central Asia. In another small but symbolic move, Mungke Temür removed any mention of Kubilai from his kingdom's coins. Return to Europe. Although Mungke Temür was not a Muslim, he maintained the Golden Horde's strong relations with Mamluk Egypt and sought favorable terms with the Byzantine Empire, which controlled the sea routes linking Mongol Russia with the Middle East. Under Mungke Temür, the Golden Horde remained at peace and continued collecting taxes from Russian subjects. His brother Tode Mungke, d. 1287, succeeded Mungke Temür after he died in 1280. After Tode Mungke converted to Islam, he focused on religion more than politics, so Nogai practically ruled the Khanate for him. Nogai controlled a part of the Khanate that bordered the Black Sea and Eastern Europe. In 1285, Nogai led Mongol forces into Europe at the request of the Hungarian king Ladislas IV, 1262 to 1290, who was not a Christian and was battling Hungary's Christian barons for power. During this invasion of Europe, Nogai occupied Transylvania in Romania. Another Mongol force, led by Tode Mungke's nephew, Teleboga, d. 1291, tried to enter Hungary through the Carpathian Mountains. Snow stopped the Mongols' advance. The frustrated troops then looted and destroyed the nearby towns. In 1286, Nogai and a second Mongol force combined to invade Poland, but this time the Poles held off the Mongols. After this largely unsuccessful campaign, the Mongols never again attacked Poland or Hungary. Nogai, however, continued to influence Bulgaria and other parts of southeastern Europe. Teleboga soon became the next Khan of the Golden Horde. He and Nogai competed for power within Russia. When a group of Mongol princes wanted to replace Teleboga with his son Toktoa, d. 1312, Nogai joined the plot to kill the Khan. Beginning in 1291, Nogai acted as the Khan of the Golden Horde, although he did not hold the title. However, Toktoa was eager to assert his rule. He and Nogai quarreled over how the Golden Horde should conduct its trade and diplomacy. The Italian city of Genoa dominated trade in the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. Genoese merchants there asked Toktoa to protect them from Nogai, who was trying to end their control of the Crimean trade. Toktoa went to war, and his forces killed Nogai in 1299. By this time, Russia was experiencing significant problems. Local residents started attacking Baskaks, a Mongol tax collector. Their influence grew as Toktoa increased his reliance on local princes for tax collection. He traveled north from Sarai to meet with them, making him the first Khan since Batu to leave the steppe and enter the forests of Russia. But Toktoa never completed his journey. He died along the way. Toktoa's nephew Ozbek, d. 1341, became the next Khan of the Golden Horde. In Russia, he made a major political move in 1327, when he named Ivan I de Bos 1341, also called Ivan Kalita, of Moscow, the Grand Prince of Russia. Ivan had helped the Mongols end a revolt in Tver, north of Moscow. After this, the political and economic power among the Russians shifted to Moscow. The Russians still needed to be stronger to challenge Mongol rule, though. Under Ozbek, Islam became the official religion of the Khanate. However, he also endeavored to maintain positive relations with Christian territories. He still fought with the Ilkhanate, trying to gain land at his Mongol cousin's expense. But, like the Golden Horde rulers before him, he failed. By the 1320s, the Mamluks and the Ilkhanate had made peace, so the Egyptian Turks had even less reason to help Ozbek. Although the Golden Horde had not lost territory, its power had peaked, and other peoples in the region were growing stronger. The great Khans had once ruled the empire, but the period of military conquest had largely ended. Over the next decades, outside threats and internal changes weakened the Mongols' rule in all the Khanates. Mongol influence across Europa reached its peak in the early years of the 14th century. Throughout that century, the four Khanates underwent many changes. By 1400, the situation in the lands the Mongols had conquered was very different in each place. In some places, Mongol influence had almost disappeared. In others, it took on new forms or passed on to rulers with few or no direct ties to the legendary Chinggis Khan. China after Kublai Khan. With the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, Mongol rule in China passed to his grandson, Temur Urlyetu, d. 1307. Mostly, Temur Urlyetu carried out Kublai's policies, although he ended plans for another attack on Japan and Vietnam. The Chinese Mongol emperors ruled only China and the Mongol homeland. Temur Urlyetu had several successors in just a short period. They all faced a familiar problem. They had to balance the interests of Mongol princes who wanted to follow traditional Mongolian customs with those of pro-Chinese Mongols and the Chinese. One positive change came for the Chinese who followed Confucius's ideas. The Emperor Ayurbarwada, d. 1320, brought back the old civil service exam system, in which people got government jobs based on how well they did on a test about Confucius. Ayurveda, one of the Mongol rulers of the Yuan dynasty, was well versed in Chinese culture. In fact, he was able to speak and read Chinese. Unrest followed the assassination of Shidabala, Ayurbarwada's son, in 1302. Various members of the Mongol royal family and their Chinese supporters competed for power. More than 10 years of civil war followed, and finally, in 1333, the last Mongol ruler in China emerged. Togun Timur, d. 1368, was 13 years old when he took the throne. He reigned for 35 years, the longest since Kubilai, but faced many problems. China experienced serious floods and epidemics of disease during Togun Timur's reign. His other problems stemmed from Mongol rule and Chinese reactions. Many people in southern China had never truly accepted the Mongols. They also resented the growing power of the local officials who taxed them and ran their lives. In 1325, peasants in the south revolted. By the 1340s, armed bandits controlled southern towns, sometimes working with local governments. The central government's power in the south weakened, and regional governments strengthened with their informal armies. Going into the 1350s, the emperor and his supporters controlled the region around Khan Balik, but only a little else. Togun Temür and his generals had trouble controlling the growing threat to their rule. Earlier wars and the need for Mongol soldiers in other parts of the empire had caused the native Mongol population to drop, which meant they could not recruit more soldiers from the Mongol homeland. Togun Timur added to his problems by relying on warlords, regional military commanders, to defend his empire. These generals would rather fight for power than maintain the empire. The rebels occasionally engaged in internal conflicts, which hindered their progress in driving out the Mongols. By 1356, a Chinese peasant soldier named Zhu Yuanzhang, 1328 to 1398, emerged as a unified rebel army leader. As a boy, Zhu studied Buddhism and learned to read and write, giving him more education than the average peasant. He led a small band of rebels and defeated competing rebel bands to gain power. He eventually became the founder of the next Chinese dynasty, the Ming. Zhu established his own government in Nanjing, southeastern China, and slowly moved his forces northward. During this time, the Mongol warlords continued to fight with one another, which prevented them from launching an effective counterattack in the south. In 1368, Zhu's armies neared Khan Balik. Togun Temür escaped north to Shangdu and fled toward Mongolia. Legend says 6 Tumans, 60,000 Mongols, joined him, but this is difficult to confirm. Others stayed in China for several years, trying to hold off the rebels. By 1382, the Chinese regained complete control of their country. China retained some Mongols and assimilated them into the population. Although defeated, Togun Temür did not give up his claim to be the Emperor of China. After he died in 1370, his son and grandson tried to reclaim Mongol authority from a base in northern China. The Chinese, however, forced the Mongols to retreat to their homeland. Another battle in 1387 led to a devastating Mongol defeat. The Chinese eventually destroyed the old Mongol capital of Karakoram. The final descendant of Kubilai, who asserted his right to govern China, met his demise in 1399. Other Mongol leaders began competing for power in and around Mongolia. In the west of Mongolia, a group of Mongols called the Oirat began establishing a mini-empire. Mongols, who still claimed family ties to Chinggis, rose to power in the east. As the two groups struggled for power, the Chinese tried to take advantage, launching an attack in the early 1400s. The Chinese won a major battle in 1410. However, within 15 years, the Eastern Mongols raided China, leading to a huge Chinese counterattack on Mongolia. The invasion did not destroy the Eastern Mongols, though. With the Eastern Mongols weakened, the Oirat tried to build a united Mongol state. Their relations with China wavered. The Ming emperors sometimes seemed friendly, but the Chinese did not want a strong Mongol presence on their border. In 1439, the Oirat leader Essen, d. 1455, came to power. He married into Chinggis's family to claim some ties to the former Great Khan. Then he gained control over the other Mongol tribes. In 1449, Esen led an invasion of China. His troops captured the Ming Emperor Zhu Jijun, r. 1436-1449. The modern historians Woodbridge Bingham, Hilary Conroy, and Fred Ilke, in A History of Asia, say the captured Ming Emperor sat serenely, showing no emotions whatsoever among 100,000 Chinese corpses and his slaughtered bodyguard. The Chinese decided not to try to get their kidnapped emperor back. Instead, they named a new emperor and continued to fight the Mongols. But Esen's war in China stirred up trouble within his own empire. The Eastern Mongolians preferred not to fight the Chinese, fearing that the costs would be too high and victory was unlikely. Esen's assassination in 1455 sparked a civil war. Finally, an Eastern. Two universal leaders? Altan Khan first gave the Mongol title Dalai to a Tibetan Lama. A Tibetan Buddhist spiritual leader receives the title of Lama. Dalai is a Mongolian word meaning vast sea or great ocean. The title of Qing is, which means oceanic or universal, is similar to Dalai, indicating that the Dalai Lama was also regarded as a universal leader. The Tibetans believe that each Dalai Lama represents the reincarnation of the first Dalai Lama, as declared by the Mongol Khan. Today, the head of Tibetan Buddhism is the 14th Dalai Lama. Reflecting the close cultural link between the Mongols and the Tibetans, Tibetan Buddhism, sometimes called Lamaism, is still the major religion in Mongolia. The 14th Dalai Lama is the head of Tibetan Buddhism. A Mongol named Dayan Khan, D. Siga, 1517, a descendant of the family of Kubilai Khan, came to power around 1480. Under him and his grandson Altan Khan, 1507-1583, the Eastern Mongols removed much of the traditional Mongol homeland from China. Altan Khan also made Tibetan Buddhism the nation's official religion. Struggles in Persia. In the Ilkhanate, the peak of Mongol rule came under Ghazan. With his death in 1304, the Ilkhanate entered an unstable period. Princes in the royal family fought for control. Ghazan had picked his brother Kharbanda, Siaki at 1280-1316, as his successor, and Kharbanda killed several relatives he considered rivals. He then took power and changed his name to Ulyetu, which means fortunate. Around this time, the four branches of the Mongol Empire entered a brief period of cooperation. As Ulyetu noted in a letter to the King of France, cited by J.A. Boyle in the Cambridge History of Iran, protected by heaven, all of us, elder and younger brothers, reached a mutual agreement. This relationship, however, did not mean the great Khan was once again ruling over a united empire. In practice, the four Khanates continued to go their separate ways, struggle with their problems, and sometimes compete for land and power. Ulyetu hoped to continue fighting the Mamluks of Egypt and receive help from the Christian rulers of Europe. But his immediate problem was in Gilan, an area near the Caspian Sea. During fierce fighting, the Mongols won several battles, and the local residents won a major victory. Eventually, the Mongols conquered Gilan, but at a very high cost. By 1308, Ulyetu learned that the European kings were not eager to help him battle the Mamluks. In 1312, he launched his only attack against the Ilkhanate's longtime enemy. A month-long siege in the Mamluks' Syrian lands failed, and Ulyetu retreated. The Mongols would never again invade Mamluk territory. The crumbling Ilkhanate. Two major decisions during Ulyetu's rule affected life within the Khanate. The first was that Ulyetu converted to the Shiite branch of Islam. The second is that he appointed Rashid al-Din to run the southern half of the realm and Ali Shah, d. 1324, to run the north. This system of dividing the daily operations of the government between two advisors was prevalent among all the Ilkhans. Both decisions led to problems. Sunni Muslims harbored a strong dislike for Shiites, and the official acknowledgement they received when the Ilkhan adopted Shiite practices. This led to conflict between members of the two branches of Islam within the government. To make things worse, the two advisors battled for control. Ul-Jaytu died in 1316, and Ali Shah's allies accused Rashid al-Din of poisoning him. The charge was false, but that did not stop Mongol officials from executing Rashid by cutting his body in half. After Rashid's death, Ul-Jaytu's son Abu Sa'id, c. of 1304-1335, became Ilkhan. When Abu Sa'id was only 12 years old, so a general named Choban, d. 1327, served as his chief advisor. When Abu Sa'id was 16, around 1320, he and Choban led a military force in Azerbaijan that fought off an attack from the Mongols of the Golden Horde. Another Mongol, a Chagatai prince, led a rebellion in 1319 in Khorasan, in what is now northeast Iran. The Ilkhanate was also able to end this threat. Abu Sa'id ruled well over the Ilkhanate until he died in 1335. He signed a peace treaty with the Mamluks and kept the government together as different groups competed for power. With his death, however, Ilkhanate politics became chaotic. Abu Sa'id was the last descendant of the powerful Mongol conqueror Hulagu to rule. He did not have a son or any male relative to take his place. Mongol princes with distant ties to Chinggis began fighting for control. These civil wars gave other ethnic groups, Persians, Arabs, and Turks, a chance to drive the Mongols out of power. Most historians say 1353 is the year the Ilkhanate ended. The peak of the Golden Horde's power in Russia came at the beginning of the 14th century. This relative peace and prosperity period ended after the reign of Ozbek, who died in 1341. Following his death in 1341, the Golden Horde was ruled by a succession of Khans. As different leaders competed for power, they sometimes fought one another. The Golden Horde also faced a threat from the east. Lithuania was becoming a military and economic power, challenging Mongol influence in Russian cities. This threat was difficult to deal with because by now the Mongols in Russia had broken into many smaller groups. By the 1370s and even earlier, two distinct hordes had emerged within the borders of the Golden Horde. In the east was the Blue Horde, centered near modern Kazakhstan. Its rulers traced their roots to Orda, the older brother of Batu, the first Khan of the Golden Horde. Batu and his descendants directly linked the White Horde to the west. By the 1370s, Urus was Khan of the White Horde. He fought for power with his nephew Toktamish, d. who supported Timur. Toktamish eventually united the Blue and White Hordes under his rule. Mamai was still involved in the Khanate's politics in 1380, when the Russians made their first serious challenge to Mongol rule. Under Ozbek, Moscow had become the home of the Grand Princes of Russia. These princes were responsible for collecting taxes from the Russians for the Mongols. Over time, the city's rulers became stronger than the other Russian leaders. In September 1380, Grand Duke Dmitry Donskoy, 1350-1389, led a Muscovite army against Mamai at Kulikovo Pole, near the Don River. The Russians won a decisive victory, and Mamai's defeat guaranteed Toktamish's rule. Toktamish came to power with Timur's support. But at the beginning of the 1390s, Toktamish tried to assert his independence from Timur. He did this by creating alliances with Egypt and Lithuania and acquiring new lands. Timur, however, struck before Toktamish could attack him. In 1395, Timur's forces destroyed Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, leading Toktamish to flee. The Golden Horde never recovered from this blow. Timur and then the Lithuanians initially selected their representatives, including Khan. The Golden Horde gradually split into two distinct groups with little power. Kazan, a city near the Volga River, was one of the few areas where the remaining Mongols from the steppes of southern Russia and eastern Ukraine settled. Later, three other groups of Mongols settled in Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. They became known as the Crimean Tatars. In 1475, the Ottomans, a Turkic people who founded an empire in Turkey, influenced the Crimean Mongols. In 1480, Ivan III, 1440-1505, called Ivan the Great, Prince of Moscow, insulted the Khan Sarai when he refused to kiss his stirrup. By tradition, the Russian princes did this to show their loyalty. Historians consider Ivan's definition the end of Mongol rule over Moscow. Ivan became one of Russia's most powerful czars, kings or emperors. The Great Horde, now known as the Mongols, planned to attack Moscow to punish Ivan, but they withdrew before they could reach the city. The Sarai Khan feared a war with Moscow would leave him defenseless against an attack by the Crimean Tatars. A war between the two groups of Mongols came in 1502, with the Crimean branch destroying the Great Horde. Moscow was now the dominant power in what had once been the heart of the Golden Horde. Ivan would go on to create the modern state of Russia. In 1552, the Russians took control of Kazan and Astrakhan, ending the Mongol presence there. The remaining Mongols, the Crimean Tatars, posed only a minor threat to Russian power. The Central Asian Mongols lived as nomads for decades after Chagatai received his ulus from Chinggis. Kebeg, d. 1326, was the first Khan there to live a sedentary lifestyle. In Transoxia, he constructed a palace. The next Khan was his brother Tamasharine, d. 1334. After converting to Islam, Tamasharine attempted to divide his Khanate from India by extending Mongol rule into the borderlands. The Mongols occasionally conducted raids in India, but lacked territorial authority. However, earlier Chagatai rulers acquired territory in Afghanistan and the eastern borders of Persia, so the Khanate's borders were wider than they were initially. Tamashirine's conversion to Islam infuriated the Ulus Chagatai Mongols, who revered the ancient nomadic culture. These conservative Mongols lived in the eastern portion of the Khanate, which included Xinjiang, Kyrgyzstan, and southeastern Kazakhstan. People occasionally called their region Mogolistan, or Land of the Mongols. In 1334, Tamashirin lost power to the conservatives. His successors, the Khans, reverted to the ancient Mongol faith. The Khanate's western region saw the rise of Turkic Muslim princes. They began appointing descendants of the Chagatai and Gegede as Khans, while maintaining their own authority. They continued to refer to this area, centered in Transoxiana Ulus, as Chagatai. The Khanate's eastern and western halves started to drift apart. The majority of the western half was Muslim, Turkic, and sedentary. Despite being more nomadic and remaining closer to the Mongols' cultural heritage, Mogolistan also had Turkic and Muslim influences. However, a Muslim leader, Tughluq Temur, Diakri 1363, rose to prominence and made Islam the official religion in Mogolistan in 1347. He reunited the two parts of the Khanate in 1360 and claimed to have family ties to Chagatam. Because of the unstable political climate in the western half of the Ulus Chagatai, Tughluq Temur's reign was short. Different tribes fought for dominance. One man eventually became the new empire's founder and supreme leader, Timur, also known as Tamerlane. The Turco-Mongol steppe culture, which stretches back hundreds of years, shaped Timur, born in Kish, near Samarkand, in 1336. His ancestry was Mongol. From a young age, he rode horses and fired arrows, like the ancient Mongol emperors. Unlike the old Khans, he spoke Turkic and grew up in an Islamic culture. Timur was a member of the ancient Mongol tribe known as the Barlas, which descended from one of Chaghatay's principal advisors in Transoxia. Although there is conflicting evidence, some historians contend that the Barlas were the Khanate's most significant local tribe. Timur's clan, while not the most significant in the tribe, played a crucial role. Some medieval sources claim that Timur once had to steal sheep to survive. The Barlas leader fled in 1360 as Tughluq Temür prepared to invade Transoxiana. After accompanying him, Timur returned to Kish to protect the tribal lands. According to some historians, Timur saw an opening to seize power during a difficult period. Up to 300 warriors, some from outside his tribe, already served under him. Additionally, Timur maintained political connections with influential figures in Mogolistan and other regions. Timur became the leader of the area when Tughluq Temür arrived in Kish. After the former leader briefly returned, Timur eventually regained his position as tribal leader. He formed alliances with other tribal leaders and continued to enjoy the support of Tughluq Temür. Soon after, Tughluq Temür decided to oust all of Transoxiana's local leaders and retake power. Timur resided in Khorasan for several years. In 1364, he went back to Transoxiana with his allies. Timur suffered the lameness-causing wounds in a battle that year. He eventually received Timur-i-Leng, which translates to Timur the Lame in Persian. Europeans transformed Timur-i-Leng into Tamerlane. Tughluq Temür's rule over the Ulus Chagatai ended in 1364, when Timur's main ally, Amir Hussein, d. 1370, took over. Timur engaged in several military operations against Mogolistan and their allies in Transoxiana throughout the following few years. He expanded his influence by interacting with different groups. Local princes admired his leadership and skill on the battlefield. Merchants valued his efforts to maintain trade, and Muslims applauded his public devotion to the faith. For many years, fighting continued inside the Ulus Chagatai. Amir Hussein attempted to rule Timur and other nearby princes as a Khan, which ultimately led to a conflict between Timur and his allies. In the end, the power struggles between the two former allies became the main focus of the Ulus Chagatai. Timur fought alongside the Mughal army against Amir Hussein for a while. Timur finally vanquished his longtime friend and had him put to death in 1370. He also claimed 4 of Amir Hussein's wives for himself simultaneously. One of them was a former Ulus Chagatai Khan's daughter. Timur established a relationship with the royal family, descended from Chinggis Khan through this wife. He attempted to gain the same respect that Central Asians showed Chinggis and his family by drawing comparisons to the fabled Khans. However, Timur refrained from claiming Khan's title. Although he was the true ruler, he appointed other men to rule as Khans and called himself the Great Commander. Timur spent several years strengthening his hold on the Ulus Chagatai and establishing his capital in Samarkand. Although Timur never had direct authority over Mongolia, his forces threatened the Mughals and made their way there. He started attacking what was formerly the eastern region of the Ilkhanate in present-day Afghanistan in 1381. Timur swiftly overran Herat, but the following year, the populace rebelled. After putting an end to the uprising, Timur's soldiers continued their tactic of chopping off the heads of the dead and piling them in a pile, a practice they carried out throughout their conquests. Timur appeared to be attempting to emulate Chinggis, who occasionally ruthlessly punished adversaries who opposed him. Timur, referring to himself as the scourge of God, believed that heaven had dispatched him to punish evildoers. The Encyclopedia of the Middle Ages quotes Timur as telling one of his enemies, "You are wicked, but I am more wicked than you, so be silent." From Afghanistan, Timur's forces advanced westward into present-day Iran. Timur wanted to increase his political power and amass wealth for himself and his army. Additionally, the great commander would refrain from attacking cities and kingdoms if their rulers agreed to his rule, just as he had done in the early Mongol conquests. In 1386, Tottemish, the leader of the Golden Horde, posed a serious threat to Timur. This Mongol leader had risen to power thanks to Timur. On the other hand, Timur controlled the Persian city of Tabriz, which the Toktamish attacked. Timur defeated the Golden Horde in 1387 after sending a sizable army into Persia. Timur's forces terrorized parts of Anatolia and Georgia during this extensive campaign. Soldiers forced several Anatolian citizens to jump off a cliff, resulting in their deaths. In contrast to the 13th century Mongols, Timur needed help establishing efficient governments in the territories he subjugated. However, due to unrest in the vanquished territories, he could not establish robust central authority, which compelled him to return repeatedly to end uprisings. In 1392, Timur's forced return to Iran signaled the beginning of what is sometimes known as the 5-year campaign. The Mongol armies entered Baghdad after bringing peace back to western Iran. David Nicol in The Mongol Warlord cited an unnamed historian who compared Timur's army to ants and locusts covering the whole countryside, plundering and ravaging. The army left Baghdad and moved north toward Georgia and Armenia. In 1395, they made their way into the Golden Horde's territory. Toktamish once again threatened Timur's lands. Timur's forces prevailed handily. They then destroyed Sarai and Astrakhan, severed civilians' heads, hands and feet, and drove the Golden Horde's army back toward Moscow. After defeating the Toktamish, Timur returned to Samarkand, his capital. His next target was in the east, where he was preparing to launch an assault on the Delhi Sultanate. Many Hindus lived in this Muslim state in northern India. Timur argued that punishing the Sultanate's rulers for allowing the Hindu faith was necessary. Delhi's immense wealth also drew him in. Timur crossed the Indus River with an army of roughly 90,000 men in 1398 and destroyed Delhi. They killed 100,000 Hindus they had captured before the battle. Timur viewed his campaign as a holy war against the Hindus, leading to the subsequent murder of more Hindus. The survivors of the Delhi massacre perished in the famine and disease that subsequently swept the city, and Timur further depleted the population by enslaving a large number of people. Once more, Tamerlane had no desire to rule over others. All he wished to do was gather tribute. He returned to Samarkand in March of 1399. He turned his attention to new targets in the west within a year. He put down another uprising in Iran before advancing to Syria, which was still under the control of the Egyptian Mamluks. He conquered Damascus, Hama, and Aleppo. Timur promised not to demolish Damascus, the capital of present-day Syria, in exchange for tribute from the populace. As a result, the people consented and allowed the invaders to enter the city. Timur then kept his word and insisted on a far more substantial tribute. When the Syrians refused, Timur ordered another massacre, instructing his soldiers to bring him one resident's head each. In the 1380s, the Mongol army left Syria and moved north to Anatolia. Near the present-day Turkish capital of Ankara, Timur routed an Ottoman Turk army in 1402. Timur returned home after gathering tribute from the Anatolian cities. Timur was brutal and bloodthirsty, but he admired the arts and had enlightening discussions with his country's finest intellectuals. To adorn and exalt his native city, he brought artisans and artists from all over his conquests to Samarkand. Although he could have managed the territories he conquered better, the ruler demonstrated practical intelligence in organizing his army and political systems. Timur adopted some of the Chinggis' strategies to build a strong army and find political allies. Subsequently, Timur seized control of a sizable portion of Asia. Similar to Chinggis, he chose generals and aides, not because of their tribal affiliations, but rather because of their personal loyalty. Additionally, he moved soldiers to different regiments, ensuring their command was separate from their tribal leaders. The Tumen was the largest unit in Chinggis' army, organized according to the same system. Timur gradually expanded his army by including conquered people, just as the first great Khan had done. Christians, Muslims, and adherents of other religions from various nations eventually made up Timur's empire's army. Timur, like all Mongols, insisted that his soldiers follow rigorous rules. Timur taught his soldiers to obey commands conveyed by a loud drum beat. Timur distributed the riches he amassed via conquest to gain their allegiance. I have not hoarded gold or jewels for myself. I admit my men to my table. They give me their lives in battle. I give generously and share in their sufferings, he wrote, quoted by David Nicol in the Mongol Warlords. Those who showed exceptional bravery or skill earned the title of Tarkhan. As a Tarkhan, a soldier did not have to pay taxes and could see the emperor without asking permission. Timur kept many old titles from the Ilkhanate and Ulus Chagatai in his administration. Two groups of officials, one Persian and one Turco-Mongol, implemented the empire's policies, managing political and military matters. The Persians concentrated primarily on political events in the sedentary regions of the empire. Timur rewarded the ruling classes in the territories he conquered with government positions, which provided the local officials' financial and political clout strengthened their allegiance to Timur. Like previous Khanates, Timur's government imposed taxes on goods along the Silk Road and other trade routes. Its primary function was to collect taxes and tributes. Like all rulers, Timur needed money to support his army and a lavish lifestyle. While royal officials collected taxes for the empire, high-ranking Persians and Turco-Mongols also played an important role in ensuring that local officials obeyed their orders, and Timur occasionally allowed local governors to remain in power after defeating them. After gaining control of all or nearly all of the former Mongol Khanates, Timur turned his attention to the greatest prize, Kubilai Khan's former empire of China, which is currently governed by the Ming dynasty, in 1404. The Turco-Mongol princes of the Ulus Chagatai and their allies fought for control after Timur's death, which ended the foreign conquests. During this period of civil war, various rulers took control of different parts of the empire, and in 1409, Timur's son Shahrukh, 1377-1447, became the next supreme leader of his father's lands. Timur had started to gather a large army to march east, but he died the year before he could begin his conquest. Following his death in 1447, Shahrukh's son, Ulugh Beg, in 1394 to 1449, assumed control of the entire empire. Shahrukh was based in Herat and ruled over Khurasan. The Gur-Emir Mausoleum's curse. In 1404, Tamerlane built an ornate mausoleum for a beloved grandson who died young. His family buried him and other well-known descendants in the Gur-Emir Mausoleum, which is also known in Arabic as Emir's Tomb. When Soviet scientists visited the mausoleum in June 1941 to open the graves within, the locals allegedly warned the scientists not to touch Tamerlane's ashes, because if they did, war would break out. The scientists disregarded the warning, and a few days later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The tomb of Tamerlane is still standing in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Known for its stunning architecture, Gur-Emir is a well-liked tourist destination in Samarkand, now in Uzbekistan. In the 1990s, the Uzbek government also paid tribute to Tamerlane by erecting statues of him. Instead of claiming a connection to Chinggis Khan and his descendants, as Timur did, Shahrukh halted his father's custom of designating a Mongol relative as the alleged ruler of the realm and adopted the Arabic sultan's title, king. The empire was relatively peaceful after Shahrukh solidified his rule, but shortly after Timur's death, local princes in Azerbaijan and modern-day Iraq gained independence from his family. Through the 15th century, Timur's empire continued to decline, though his descendants, the Mughals, would establish a strong new state in India. The Mongol influence would also persist throughout Central Asia and the far-flung regions once ruled by the great Khans. The clan was the fundamental Mongol social and political unit before Chinggis Khan's rise. It comprised several related families whose main goals were cooperation and survival. Blood ties, relationships within the clan and the tribes, determined a person's social standing. By the end of the 12th century, clans had started to form larger units called tribes. The Mongol tribe's ruling clan, the Borjigid or Kiyad, believed they were born from heaven and were referred to as white bone, while commoners were known as people of the black bone. The ruling clan enforced tribal customs and decided who would fight and when. Leaders came from the most powerful clans within a tribe, and voters probably chose the man in charge already, because he had the ability and authority to govern the tribe. Some historians contend that the Kuriltai was not a true election, because not all Mongols could run for the top job. Tribes elected their leaders at political meetings, social feasts, and quilters. The Chinggis selected tribal leaders based on their military skills and ties to aristocratic families. And the first may have been religious leaders known as shamans. In carrying out tribal affairs, the leaders depended on nökers, who followed leaders who sought the greatest wealth or military power. They served as personal servants and bodyguards for their leaders and provided their greatest service during military campaigns by recruiting and leading soldiers to fight for the leader. Leaders, particularly the Khans, fostered loyalty among their nökers by rewarding them with wealth taken during conquests or from taxes collected in the foreign lands under Mongol control. A Khan's wife could become a regent or temporary ruler after her husband's death until the next great Khan was elected. Some wives could also influence the Khan's decisions. Kubilai Khan frequently followed the advice of his favorite wife, Chabi, d. 1281. Generally speaking, women did not actively participate in politics or the military outside the royal family. Mongol Khans typically had multiple households, each headed by a different wife. A man of the ruling class typically had several wives, one of whom was typically regarded as the chief or favorite wife, and the Mongols sought wives from outside their clans, thereby fortifying their bonds with one another. Slavery did not have a chance to flourish in the nomadic Mongol culture because it was more prevalent in sedentary societies. But the Mongols also included people who resembled those who were enslaved. Following a successful battle, Mongol commanders took the surviving relatives of their enemies as Oturgus Boğols, who were allowed to own property but not leave their masters. Over time, some Oturgus Boğols received familial treatment, while others gained social prominence. Families frequently sold Boğols into slavery. According to the secret history of the Mongols, one famished Turkic man sold his son into slavery for a morsel from the flesh of a dead deer. Boğols were a lower class of enslaved people who had fewer opportunities to pursue wealth or social influence. The imperial government's ascent. Most historians credit Chingis's rise as a great conqueror to his political skill and military prowess. Temujin, Chingis's birth name, became the Khan of his tribe around 1185, and it took him another 20 years to become the great Khan. He brought all the tribes of Mongolia together and established a new system of governance in a vast and ethnically diverse society. Chinggis replaced many of the old clan and tribal leaders with his own loyal military commanders. After becoming Great Khan, Chinggis divided his army into 95 groups, each with 1,000 soldiers, and ordered all fit men to enlist in the military. Disregarding the Mongolian practice of placing soldiers from the same tribe in the same group, Chinggis dispersed them throughout all the units to keep them from banding together and launching an uprising. Military commanders also expected their soldiers' families to obey their orders. If the Khan wanted a different commander in charge, a commander could lose his job, and a commander's son could inherit his father's position. Chinggis also created the Imperial Guard, known as the Keshikten, Mongolian for those with favor, which included archers, night guards, and day guards. Chinggis claimed, quoted in The Secret History of the Mongols, that these special soldiers watch over my golden life. In addition to protecting the Great Khan, the Keshikten carried out his orders and ensured the troops were prepared for battle. As the empire expanded, the Keshikten provided the royal government staff and frequently represented the Great Khan in far-off places. Before the Khans came, the clans owned the pastures, not individuals. Chinggis ruled the empire for his family, not for himself. The only difference was that his family's lands were spread across an empire, not just a few Mongolian pastures. Although authority and dominion seem to belong to one man, namely whoever is nominated Khan, yet in reality, all the children, descendants, and uncles partake of kingship and property. This arrangement changed somewhat as separate uluses developed among Chingis's sons. Still, within each Khanate, the royal family adhered to the traditional Mongol ideas of ownership, according to the Persian historian Juvayni, quoted by Peter Jackson in The Mongol Empire and Its Legacy. Paul Rachnevsky quotes the Chinggis as saying, shortly after he was given his title, "Punish robbery within the nation and clean up the deception." The Chinggis did this by uniting the Mongol tribes, which had a long history of conflict. The Great Khan was determined to use his power to create order. He put an end to those who should be killed and penalized those who should be fined. The Great Jasak is a legal code that Chinggis created for the Mongols in 1206. Chinggis appointed his brother-in-law as the chief judge, whose job was to record the laws and ensure their observance. Chinggis is governed by decree, which gives his rules and declarations legal force. Modern Western historians wrote about this legal code for many years, but recently, some historians have questioned the idea that Chinggis created it all at once. There is no written record of the Great Jasak. Instead, it was cited in the works of later historians like Rashid al-Din. The Chinggis codified many of their decrees into formal laws, and subsequent Khans recorded them in books and added their own, creating a collection of partially written and partially unwritten laws. We are interested in whether the Mongols of Chinggis's time had a written legal code, but they did have unwritten tribal laws. The Great Jasak legal code was a collection of affairs and military operations. Because the law of the army was so important to the Mongol Empire, the laws enforced strict military discipline. A soldier who failed to stop to pick up a dropped bow or other equipment would be executed. Giovanni di Plano Carpini wrote in The Story of the Mongols Whom We Call the Tartars, "When the line goes into battle, if 1 or 2 or 3 or more flee from the squad of 10, all 10 are dead." The Mongols also had strict political laws. Anyone who tried to rule without first winning a Kuriltai was executed. Additionally, they are killed if 1, 2 or more bravely enter the battle, and the other 10 do not follow. When the Mongols were strictly nomads, they taxed their people by taking a portion of their herds. When they started to rule over sedentary societies, they made everyone pay a tax on goods or money. And when they started to tax trade, they taxed a percentage of the goods sold. The Mongol legal system included taxation, just like other cultures. The Mongol rulers needed a method to guarantee that the wealth was dispersed equitably, because in theory, the Ulysses and wealth belonged to every member of the Khan family. This system was established by the Jarku, and the Khan and other clan leaders met at the Jarku, which oversaw all clan affairs, including financial matters. Jarkuchi, or officials, distributed the wealth to the clan members. The Yarkuchi also censused the local population in the defeated lands, and the Great Khan used the official count to determine the region's tax owed before distributing the funds to the local rulers and his family. The role of local officials. When the Mongols began conquering foreign lands, they had to create new political systems and rely on the help of local officials. Chinggis used officials called Darukachi and Baskaks to rule for him in distant lands. They collected taxes, raised troops, and settled disputes between local officials and nobles. Usually friendly to Mongol rule, the Darukachi were considered equal to the Mongols due to their military service for the Great Khan. The Khan selected locals known as Baskaks to work for him. They eventually played a prominent role in the affairs of the Golden Horde, as the Mongols in Russia never established a strong central government. In the other countries, the Mongols used existing political structures to help them run local affairs. During the early years of the Mongol Empire, one of the key foreign officials was Mahmud Yalavach, d. 1262, a Muslim from Khwarezm. Under Chinggis, he served as a Baskak. Ögedei gave him control over all of China under Mongol rule. A series of Jarkuchi and other officials served under him. His son, Mas'ud Beg, d. 1280s, held a similar position in Turkestan, a region centered in the cities of Central Asia. The early Mongol Khans also relied on Uyghurs and other Turkic people of Central Asia to staff their imperial courts. Thus, the governments that developed in Central Asia and Persia were mostly Turco-Mongol rather than purely Mongol. By Ögedei's death in 1241, the Mongols had split their lands beyond Mongolia into 3 main provinces. This division ensured they could keep strict control over the sedentary people. The province system excluded Russia because it was not yet advanced and wealthy enough. The province system divided China into smaller political units after the empire split into separate khanates. The Mongols initiated this system, which continues to divide provinces in China today. Kubilai Khan's East Asian Empire was the largest among the 4 states that emerged from the Mongol Empire. The Great Khan considered China the grandest prize of the Mongol Empire. Chinese historians kept detailed records, so modern historians know more about it than the other Khans. Kubilai's China has also drawn more Western interest because of the writings of Marco Polo and other Europeans who traveled there. As both the Emperor of China and the Mongol Great Khan, Kubilai blended the political systems of the two peoples. The overall political structure, however, was more clearly Mongol, with the government focused on tribal organizations. Although many government officials and departments received Chinese names, Kubilai relied on Jarkuchi and Darukachi to carry out their traditional functions. Kubilai wanted to at least appear Chinese and hold on to the loyalty of his conquered subjects. Soon after the 1260 Kuriltai, some of Kubilai's Chinese advisors offered suggestions on how to run his central government. Not surprisingly, they wanted to keep as many traditional Chinese structures as possible. Kubilai accepted some of their ideas concerning economics. The government, for example, issued paper money and kept control of certain key industries, such as mining. However, the Great Khan rejected maintaining the examination system for selecting civil servants, the government workers responsible for most daily activities. The design of the Chinese system ensured that the most talented individuals served in the government, irrespective of their family connections or the ruling party. Candidates for the civil service took examinations that tested their knowledge of Chinese history, literature, and philosophy. Those who passed the examination received government appointments. One of China's greatest thinkers, Confucius, dominated the civil service exam with his ideas. Kubilai, however, was more interested in selecting civil servants who were loyal to him. He ended the examination system. Kubilai divided the people of his empire into 4 classes. At the top were the Mongols, Western and Central Asians, and the Jin of northern China. The Song of southern China was at the bottom. Most of the emperor's most trusted officials came from the first 2 groups. Kubilai eventually split the army into 3 parts. A Mongol cavalry under his direct control, a provincial cavalry under local commanders, a Chinese infantry. Kubilai also tried to make the government more efficient. He eliminated some departments and directed affairs through 3 main offices. The Secretariat handled most civilian issues. The Privy Council addressed military affairs. The Censorate made sure local officials performed their duties. Kubilai set strict penalties for government officials who broke the law or whose work did not meet Khan standards. For example, Kubilai might punish a lazy official with beatings. The same punishment happened to officials who took bribes or used government workers to help them in their private lives. Mongol dominance, however, needed to be more consistent throughout China. Despite his established systems, Kubilai required greater authority in the more remote provinces. Although he demanded obedience and honesty, his legal system was milder than the ones under some earlier and later Chinese dynasties. Kubilai, in China, relied on a communication system known as the jam. The Great Khan, Gede, first developed this system in his ulus, gradually spreading to the other khanates. For thousands of years, traders and travelers have traveled along the Silk Road, which connects China and Central Asia, traversing hot deserts and high mountain passes to reach the Middle East. The Silk Road is actually a network of interconnected roads. Its name comes from silk, one of the most valuable products from China to the West. The Mongols actively promoted trade along the Silk Road, especially in silk. Diplomats and merchants occasionally utilized the jam. Riders were required to provide proof of their authorization to use the system. Officials or messengers working for the government carried a jere, or tablet of authority. They crafted this oval plaque from wood, silver, or gold. The Mongols borrowed the idea of jam from the Khitans, but used it on a much larger scale. Other Asian governments later copied the system, and during the 19th century, the US government tried something similar with its Pony Express mail service. The army was the first of the Mongol imperial institutions. The roads constructed to speed riders along the Jam also played an important role in Mongol China's commerce. Kubilai promoted trade by taxing it, allowing groups of merchants known as ortok to utilize the Jam. Mongol. China relied on Islamic merchants from Central Asia to move goods in and out of the empire along land routes. They brought in camels, horses, medicines, and spices. Chinese merchants exported textiles, ceramics, and food. Merchants also transported their goods by boat, sailing from Chinese ports such as Fuzhou and Guangzhou. There was overseas trade with South Asian nations, including India, Indonesia, and distant Persia. Boats also carried goods along China's many rivers. Kubilai Khan reconstructed and extended China's Grand Canal from about 486 BCE. The canal is about 200 miles long and runs from Beijing to Hangzhou. Even today, parts of the canal remain in use. The canal made it easier to transport grain and other foods from the interior of China to the capital of Khan Balik. With Hulagu's conquests and the creation of the Ilkhanate, the Mongols gained control of Persia and neighboring lands. The Mongols took over a government and society dominated by Islam, although there were large Christian and Jewish minority communities. The Quran, the Muslim holy book, set down the laws of Islamic society. Under Hulagu, Mongol laws became more important, though the local people also continued to live under Islamic law. The Mongols tolerated all religions, which weakened Islam's role in the government until the Ilkhans converted to that faith. Even then, some Mongol leaders wanted to return to traditional laws. In the early 14th century, according to David Morgan in The Mongols, one Mongol general told other Mongols that abandoning the great Jasak of Chinggis Khan for the Quran was a disgraceful and dishonorable act. As in China, the Ilkhans used some existing political structures to impose their rule. Hulagu and his successors, however, were more likely to use native officials in top positions. Several key officials who helped the Mongols govern came from the family of the Persian Baha al-Din Juvaini, d. 1253. The Jewish doctor Sad al-Dawlat, d. 1291, was another important non-Mongol official. Serving under Arghun in the late 13th century, he enforced tax laws, sometimes by using torture. The Persians disliked Sad al-Dawlat because of these harsh tactics, and because he was Jewish. He also gave out government positions to his friends and relatives. But the historian Wasaf, 1264-1334, admitted, as cited by J.A. Boyle in the Cambridge History of Iran, that his reforms led to the disappearance of oppression, robbery, and thieving. Sad al-Dawlat enforced strict measures against government officials who embezzled public funds and made sure Muslims faced trials under their own legal system, not the Mongol one. Like other officials, Sad al-Dawlat had to follow the decrees of the Ilkhans and deal with Mongol princes and generals who wanted to collect their own taxes and otherwise dominate the regions where they lived. While ruling their lands, the first Ilkhans also had duties as part of the larger Mongol Empire. More so than the other Ulises, the Ilkhanate remained loyal to the Great Khan. That changed when Ghuzan took power. He seemed to break with the Mongols of East Asia when he dropped Ilkhan and took the Muslim title of Sultan. He also removed the Great Khan's name from his coins. The Ilkhans never again considered themselves part of a larger Mongol empire. However, these changes might have been intentional to garner local support from the Persians and Arabs, ensuring the Ilkhanate maintained strong military and diplomatic ties with the Great Khan. One link between the Ilkhanate government and the court of the Great Khan was a Mongolian official named Bolad, circa year 1240 to 1313. His family belonged to one of the Mongol tribes that came under Chinggis's rule before Chinggis became the Great Khan. Kubilai chose Bolad to be his ambassador in Tabriz, the Ilkhanate capital. Bolad arrived there in 1285. For almost 20 years, he loyally served the different Ilkhans who came to power. He was a chief advisor for Arghun and served the Ilkhanate on the battlefield. Bolad helped strengthen the Persian Mongols' ties to their traditional nomad culture. Ghazan weakened the Mongol traditions. He converted to Islam and forced Christians and Buddhists within his lands to also convert, giving Islam greater influence among the ruling class. However, only occasionally did the government unite, leading to subsequent struggles for influence among the followers of the two main branches of Islam. One of Ghazan's major goals at home was reforming the government's impact on the local economy. According to some historians, Mongol rule in Persia had led to cruelty and mismanagement. In some cities, Mongol raids had left half of all the homes empty, with the residents dead or forced to flee. Taxes on commerce made it difficult for the towns and cities to rebuild. Ghazan wanted to fix tax rates so everyone knew what they owed, and local princes could not demand higher payments for themselves. Additionally, he implemented a new currency system and aimed to enhance the jam message system, emulating China's approach. Ghazan tried to improve the system for paying the army and encouraged farmers to return to abandoned land. He bestowed upon his commanders lands intended for troop support. In the Islamic world, rulers and other wealthy people sometimes create a waqf, which sets aside revenue from land or a business enterprise to maintain mosques and support charities. Ghazan created new land waqfs and used the money to help the elderly and sick. Some historians believe Ghazan's changes had some positive effects, especially in improving peasants' lives. Others, however, are still determining how deeply the reforms truly changed the lives of the overtaxed peasants. After Ghazan's death, the Mongol princes who had lost power due to his reforms regained control, which resulted in increased economic stress. As in China, Ilkhanate merchants participated in a vast trade network that linked Asia with Europe and North Africa. Some towns were famous for specific products. For instance, Shiraz was a hub for ironworks and wool weaving, whereas Isfahan garnered recognition for its silk and cotton production. Both cities are located in modern-day Iran. The establishment of markets, known as bazaars, in locations the Mongols frequently passed while traveling between their summer and winter camps, led to the flourishing of other cities. This local political system largely remained intact after Batu's conquest and the coming of the Golden Horde. Batu and his successors sought tribute and were not concerned about having direct control over Russian lands. They were steppe dwellers and did not want to live in the northwest forests. The Mongols controlled the steppe regions of their Khanate, leaving the towns to the Russian princes. Focusing on the steppe also allowed them to collect taxes on the trade along the Silk Road and other caravan routes. For the most part, the Mongols did not interact with the Russians. Their direct cultural contact was with the Kipchak nomads, a Turkic people of the steppes. Both peoples led a traditional nomadic lifestyle. One clear sign of the importance of Turkic culture among the Golden Horde turned up before the end of the 13th century. The Turkic language replaced Mongol on the Khanate's coins. In the Russian towns and cities, the Mongols sent baskaks to collect taxes, and Mongol soldiers protected them as they carried out their duties. The Mongols also recruited some local men to serve in their army. At times, the recruitment process could be violent, as the Mongols forced Russians to serve in their army. The Russians also had to pay for Mongol officials food and housing. The The Mongols based these taxes on the number of households in a region, borrowing a system first developed in China. The Mongols also collected taxes on trade. The Mongols forced individuals who could not pay taxes into slavery. If the local people refused to pay tribute or rebelled against the Mongol officials, the Khan quickly sent large military forces from the steppes to assert Mongol rule. With their typical tolerance for all religions, the rulers of the Golden Horde did not make Russia's Orthodox Church pay taxes. The church leader dispatched a representative to Sarai to maintain good relations. The Orthodox Church grew wealthy due to its relations with Khan and its freedom from taxes. This arrangement did not deter local priests from speaking against Mongol rule, which needed to align with Christian values. One Russian chronicle. The late 13th century records several sermons by a bishop named Serapion, d. 1275. Serapion, as quoted by Charles Halperin in the Teta Yoke, called the Mongols merciless heathen, having neither mercy for the young, for the weak and aged, nor for infants. Yet Serapion and other religious leaders believed the Russians had themselves to blame for this treatment. They felt the Mongol conquest was God's way of punishing Russians for their sins. The Russian princes kept most of their local power, but the Mongols never let the princes forget they owed their power to the Khan. The princes had to travel to the Golden Horde's capital of Sarai, or until 1259, to Karakorum to receive a yarlik. This was a document that spelled out the prince's right to rule. Many princes seem to have made their wills out before they left, not knowing if they would survive the journey or the meeting with their Mongol masters. Though afraid of their Mongol lords, the Russian princes used the conquest to their advantage. With his loyal service to Batu and Berka, Alexander Nevsky developed more power than other Russian princes, helping to build wealth for himself and his family. Princes could also use their ties to the Mongols to control their local populations. Richard Pipes notes that under the old regime, a prince only needed to threaten to summon the Mongols to gain their obedience in Russia. Some Russian princes also used violence to keep order. Mongol words related to punishment became part of the Russian language. A nagaika refers to a type of whip, while kandali refers to chains. Both of these Mongolian words entered the Russian language unchanged. Under the Mongols, the Russians had their first death penalty, and the Khanates used it against disloyal princes. Although the Golden Horde brought violence, Russians saw some economic benefits. With Mongol protection, Russian merchants could travel to the Caspian and Black Seas to trade with Persians and Turks. The Russians offered furs and grains, and the fur trade helped turn Moscow into a major city. Goods also flowed through the Golden Horde's lands on their way to Egypt. The commerce included glass, pottery, and enslaved people. As always, the Mongols encouraged international trade by collecting taxes on it. In the 14th century, Moscow, also called Muscovy, became the center of Russian military and political power. Even after the princes of Moscow overthrew the Golden Horde, they retained some Mongol methods for tax collection, government organization, and army management. The Mongol influence lasted until the late 17th century, when Russian Tsar Peter the Great eliminated systems based on Mongol practices and replaced them with European methods of government. Historians of the Ulus Chagatai Mongols know less about Ulus Chagatai than other Khanates. The region remained mostly nomadic, and neither the Mongols nor the defeated local peoples kept detailed written records. Even the Khanates' precise borders are unknown, although it included Transoxiana and Semireche, modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and southeastern Kazakhstan, and western Xinjiang, which now forms the western part of China. Chagatai and his descendants did not take over a large, established empire like the Mongols in China and Persia. The Chagatai Khans did not have a true capital city and generally ignored their empire's cities. When they held a Kuriltai, the Mongol leaders usually met in Al-Malik, now Uzbekistan. The rest of the time, the leaders lived nomadic lives along the Ili River, which flows from western China into Kazakhstan. Kaidu, not a direct descendant of Chagatai, dominated the Ulus Chagatai in the later decades of the 13th century. He aspired to govern lands he believed belonged to his branch of Chinggis Khan's family, founded by Gege. Kaidu's influence forced the Khanate into wars with other Mongols and sparked a civil war within the Ulus. Still, he also brought some stability. He provided defense against non-Mongol nomads from the north and rebuilt some cities. The Ulus Chagatai was truly free of Kaidu's control in the reign of Dua, d. 1307. Some historians call him the greatest Khan of the Ulus. He tried to introduce reforms similar to the ones Ghazan carried out in Persia. The Chagatai rulers followed the Mongol Jasak and traditional political ways until the Khans converted to Islam in the 14th century. Until then, the Mongols mostly let the Muslims of Chagatai do as they pleased, as long as they paid their taxes. Muslim governors, watched over by Mongol or Turkish officials, ruled in the sedentary areas of the Khanate. The Mongols of Central Asia aimed to transform some of their Ulus farmland into steppe, where their herds could graze. Local officials convinced them that using the land for agriculture would increase tax revenue, so the Mongols gave up the plan. Still, in some regions, this transformation did occur. Shihab al-Din al-Umari, d. Chiara 1348, a Syrian geographer, described what he saw on a visit to Turkestan, as quoted by Svat Suchek in A History of Inner Asia. A person finds the building still standing but devoid of humans, except for some nomads and herders, without any agriculture. What is green there consists of steppe vegetation, which nobody has sown or planted. With its steppe lands and nomadic values, the Ulus Chagatai had less commerce than the other Khanates. Most economic activity centered on the few cities that survived the original Mongol invasion, such as Samarkand and Bukhara. Smaller towns, such as Al-Malik and Basik, also served as commercial centers. The Silk Road linked the Khanate with the major trading centers of Eastern and Western Asia. Mongol lands are home to art, science, and culture. Throughout history, cultures settled in one place have made the greatest achievements in arts and science. In early societies based on agriculture, the people eventually developed farming methods that enabled fewer workers to produce enough food for everyone. More people then had time to pursue other activities, such as arts and crafts, writing literature, educating others, and developing science and technology. Because nomads, like the Mongols, were constantly moving, carrying all their belongings, they could not establish museums or universities. Certainly, they must master the various skills of artisans and apply their scientific knowledge. They undoubtedly possess a wealth of cultural and educational traditions. As the Mongols proved, once nomadic peoples conquered cities, they could also appreciate the value of other cultures' artistic and intellectual achievements. Thousands of years before the Mongol tribes settled in Mongolia, people in the region painted scenes of everyday life in caves. These cave paintings, called petroglyphs, illustrate one of the earliest forms of nomadism. The earliest artists of Mongolia painted on rocks and other natural surfaces and created large monuments called deer stones. These stones ranged from about 6 to 30 feet high and featured carvings of deer and other animals. Historians believe The stones marked the graves of important leaders and warriors. Other art items from the era before the Mongols include jewelry, pottery, and felt carpets. The Mongols made similar items, finding ways to decorate the tools they used daily. Clothes and other items featured embroidered designs symbolizing such things as fire or the artist's hopes for the future. About 7,000 symbols are known and still appear in modern Mongolian art. The Mongols also made musical instruments and wrote songs, usually dealing with animals and aspects of nomadic life. The morin kur, a two-stringed instrument, was among them. The first ones were made from horse skin and hair. They used the morin kur to mimic the sounds of animals and nature. The Mongols also developed other string instruments and played drums and flutes. The earliest Mongol dances emerged from the shamans' movements as they entered trances, mental states where they seemed unaware of the world, to reach the spirit world. Singing and dancing were an important part of festivals. Folk dances were performed either inside or just outside the Mongols' jurs. The small space led to a dancing style that stressed moving the hands, head, and upper body, and limited leg movements. Today, Mongolians still dance this way, even when they have more room to move. The Mongols passed on their history and folk tales by memorizing and telling them to one another. Some proverbs date back at least to the times of the Huns, which ended around the 4th century. The first Mongol alphabet did not appear until 1206, when Chinggis Khan decided to use the script of the Uyghur Turks. The Naimans, one of the tribes Chinggis defeated in Mongolia, already used this script. The Naimans wrote words from top to bottom and read sentences from left to right, just like in English. The only major piece of writing that survived the empire was the secret history of the Mongols. Other writings have survived only in Persian or Chinese translations. Historians have debated whether it is pure fiction or a mixture of fact and fantasy. The beginning, for example, says that the first Mongols descended from a bluish wolf and a deer. Most historians, however, accept that the secret history is accurate when it describes the events of Chinggis's life. Historians persistently dispute the writing date of the secret history of the Mongols. The unidentified author or authors asserts that they completed the book during the Mouse's year. Like the Chinese, the Mongols base their calendar on 12-year cycles, naming each year after a different animal. Many parts of Asia still use this calendar system today. By examining other dates and events mentioned in the secret history, historians believe that 1228, 1240, or 1252 are the most likely years of the Mouse in which the book was written. Mongol technology. By studying nature, using trial and error, and borrowing from neighboring peoples, the Mongols created technology that made daily life easier. An example is the GR, a warm, comfortable, and portable house. Among the greatest Mongol achievements came in warfaring, especially archery. The Mongols developed a bow of several layers of wood and animal horns. This bow required greater strength to pull than other bows, but it remained flexible, longer than other bows, and shot arrows farther. The Mongols also developed a wide range of arrows, each with a specific purpose. A short arrow was useful for hunting small animals. We used heavy arrows against armored enemies, or when the arrow needed to penetrate deeply into its target. The Mongols also had a special whistling arrow that made noise in flight or when it struck its targets. The Mongols used these arrows to send signals. Arrowheads were often made of bone. Once again, the Mongols used different types of heads for specific purposes. Small arrowheads were good for entering hard surfaces. Wider heads created more damaging wounds when they struck an animal or an enemy soldier. For Mongol men, hunting was an important part of survival. However, hunting served as both a leisure activity and a social gathering for the elite. Even as they settled in sedentary communities, the Mongols valued hunting as a recreational activity. In his summer capital of Chengdu, Kublai Khan built an enormous hunting park. The park had streams and woods, and deer roamed the grounds. Kublai also hunted in the wild, using trained lions and leopards to help him. The animals he hunted included boars, wild pigs, bears, and deer. The Mongols also enjoyed falconry, using trained falcons to capture small game and other birds. Their trained birds included large eagles. Marco Polo noted in his travels that those specifically trained to wolf catching are very large and powerful birds, and no wolf can escape from them. Chinese culture and the Mongols. Before their conquests, the Mongols had contact with China through trade and political alliances. The Chinese built their first dynasty almost 1,500 years before Temujin earned the title of Great Khan. Throughout history, the Chinese excelled at writing in many forms and styles, especially philosophy. Even before the first Chinese dynasty, a group of influential thinkers set down rules of society and government that continued to influence China through Mongol times and beyond. The most important of these thinkers was Confucius. He taught that everyone had a specific societal role and should accept their position. People had a moral obligation to act within this role. For example, just as a citizen had a duty to obey the rulers had to govern fairly. Confucius's ideas helped shape the system that trained government officials in China. Kublai was suspicious of Chinese officials in his government, but Confucians still served the Mongols. These Chinese officials hoped they could make the Mongols accept Chinese culture and rule less harshly. The Confucians tried to teach Kublai their beliefs, but his limited knowledge of Chinese made this difficult. Despite this, the Great Khan taught his second son Confucianism and other aspects of Chinese culture. To further link the Mongols with the Chinese and to help educate them, Kublai had some Confucian books translated into Mongolian. Kublai also approved the establishment of the National History Office to document Mongol rule in China. Throughout China's rise to power as the dominant nation in East Asia, its rulers supported the arts. Under Kublai and his Mongol supporters, this support continued. Kublai enjoyed theatre and had plays staged at his royal palaces. Theatres also drew large crowds in China's cities during his rule. Yuan dynasty theatre often combined short plays or skits with singing and dancing. Theatrical performances might also include mime and acrobatics. Actors and other entertainers had higher social status under the Kubil than in the Jin and Song dynasties. The Mongols also did not limit what subjects playwrights could show on stage. Under the old Confucian system, playwrights came from the class of educated government officials. Kublai ended the civil service examination system, and anyone could write and stage plays. Under Kublai, playwrights and novelists also had greater freedom to use the language of everyday conversation, not the more formal language favored by native Chinese rulers. During Kublai's rule, more books appeared in China than during previous dynasties. In 1269, the Great Khan set up a government. He established an office to print books and later donated land to schools, allowing them to use the land's income to publish texts. In general, the Chinese were not interested in novels. They preferred poetry and essays, but these two written forms received less support from the Mongols than plays and novels. When the Mongols arrived in China, they restricted Chinese poetry and essays to several years-old conventions. They followed the Confucian ideals with which educated Chinese were familiar. For the Mongols, however, these very formal, subtle forms of literature were less intriguing and meaningful than the more narrative plays and novels. Still, Kubilai and his successors did invite poets to their palaces. The visual arts in Mongol China. Kubilai and the other Mongol rulers of China appreciated their subjects' skills in making beautiful decorations. The Chinese had a long history as talented painters, sculptors, and porcelain, fine pottery makers. They carved intricate designs into ivory, jade, and lacquer, a hard material made from the sap of Asian trees. Chinese artisans also produced colorful textiles out of silk and cotton. Chinese artisans wore some textiles as clothes and hung others as art on the walls. The Mongols did not make any specific contributions to the visual arts in China, but several important developments occurred under their rule. The government kept some educated Confucians out of government service, leading them to use the arts for employment and self-expression. Under the Yuan dynasty, a style of painting called Wenren-hua first appeared. The name means literary man's painting in Chinese. The paintings were created by well-educated amateur artists who aimed to appeal to educated individuals. Wenren-hua artists often painted highly detailed scenes from nature that depicted their own emotions. Their work differed from the paintings done by official artists who had trained at the Song Dynasty Academy for Art. Traditional paintings focused on portraits, religious subjects, and scenes from everyday life. One Chinese painter at the Great Khan's court, Zhao Mengfu, 1254–1322, was famous for his paintings of horses, a popular subject with the Mongols. Sculpture under the Mongols tended to focus on traditional subjects. Buddhists purchased the majority of sculptures, which primarily addressed religious themes. Sculptors worked with stone, wood, and bronze to create their images. Artists also carved reliefs, three-dimensional images that rose from a flat surface. The old writing returns. Chinggis used Mongol script until 1942. At that time, Mongolia was under the influence of the Soviet Union. Soviet officials compelled the Mongolians to use the Cyrillic alphabet, a Russian invention, to write their language. By 1990, only about 10% of Mongolians, mostly elderly, could still read the Mongolian script. However, the Mongolian script survived in a part of Mongolia that became a region of China, called Inner Mongolia. As the Soviet Union began to break up in the early 1990s, many aspects of traditional Mongolian culture slowly returned. In the last few years, the Mongolian government has started teaching the traditional Mongolian script in schools. Mongolian script is slowly being revived. Under Kubilai, northern and southern Chinese artistic styles came together. His rule also helped bring Chinese influences to other lands, such as Persia, and introduced foreign artistic elements to China. One important influence on the empire came from Tibet. Aniga, 1244–1306, a Tibetan Buddhist artist and architect from Nepal, impressed the Phagpa Lama with his artistic talents. The Lama brought the artist to Kubilai, where he received commissions to construct temples and other buildings in Shangdu and Khan Balik. Aniga also designed gold jewelry, and the Great Khan eventually had him supervise all the artisans in China. The Tibetan influence on Chinese art included depicting religious figures wearing jewelry and colorful ornaments. Science and technology in Mongol China. The Mongol Empire's wide geographic range helped bring new ideas to China. At the same time, the Mongols took Chinese technology and spread it to Western Asia. One important Chinese technology was printing. The Chinese published the first books by carving characters onto wooden blocks. After dipping each block in ink, the printer pressed it onto a page. Historian Paul D. Buell suggests that the Mongols may have introduced block printing to the Middle East. a practice that has been in use in China for centuries. As noted earlier in this chapter, Kubilai encouraged printing in China, which helped spread literacy in the dynasties that followed the Yuan. For many of his personal and political decisions, Kubilai relied on astrology. He and other Mongols wanted future predictions to make decisions. Marco Polo noted, in the Travels of Marco Polo, that the capital city of Khan Balik had about 5,000 astrologers who predicted that there would be thunder and storms in a certain month and earthquakes in another. To help his astrologers, Kubilai built a large observatory in Khan Basic, where astronomers calculated the positions of the stars and planets. These people combined real science with astrology in their work. Many of the most learned astrologers and astronomers were Persians. The Chinese astronomer Guo Shoujing, 1232–1316, used a Persian calendar to create an accurate calendar. After their conquests, the Mongols turned to outsiders for new medical knowledge. During their early nomadic years, the Mongols relied mostly on their shamans to heal them, which they did by using herbal remedies and contacting the spirit world. Their exposure to more scientific approaches to healing came from the Chinese and Tibetan Buddhists and the Persian Muslims. Kubilai built a large medical college that housed ancient Chinese medical texts written on stone slabs. Chinese medicine was based on the idea that the body is filled with a special energy called qi. Blocked or unbalanced qi leads to illness. Doctors use herbal medicine and acupuncture to restore the correct flow and balance of energy. With acupuncture, the doctors place very thin needles at specific spots on a patient's body. Chinese doctors also use acupuncture on animals. A document from just after. Why is it so hard to make a calendar? Early peoples marked the months by the phases of the moon, and the years by the movements of the sun and the change of seasons. Since the 12 phases of the moon add up to only about 354 days, while the year lasts about 365, 1/4. Days, the phases of the moon, movements of the sun, and changes of seasons rapidly get out of sync. Different cultures have solved this problem in different ways. In ancient Rome, Julius Caesar followed the advice of Egyptian astronomers and designed a calendar. It disregarded the moon's phases and solely adhered to the sun. This Julian calendar is the ancestor of the Gregorian calendar we use today. Muslims use a lunar calendar that follows only the moon and ignores the sun. Thus, New Year's Day slowly cycles through all 4 seasons. The Chinese calendar followed the moon and the sun, but used a complex mathematical formula to add extra months every few years to balance the two. The Mongols also adopted this system, the end of the Yuan dynasty. The Persians gave Chinese doctors new herbal drugs, and a Muslim medical book discussed how to treat burns, animal bites, and other wounds. The exchange was also reciprocal. Hulagu seems to have brought some Chinese medical practices to Persia. For the Mongols, the influence of Persian and Chinese technology was greatest in warfare. In about 1000, the Chinese used gunpowder to make fireworks, but historians are still trying to determine its first military use. The Chinese also used gunpowder to make grenades, a technique they may have learned from the Muslims of Syria. Moreover, the Chinese possessed simple arrow-firing guns. The Mongols used all these weapons and may have been the first people to use cannons designed by their Chinese engineers. The Song seems to have developed the first land mines to stop the Mongol invasion. One type of mine lured an enemy with a desirable object, such as an abandoned weapon. As the soldier approached the object, he stepped on a device just under the ground that lit a fuse and exploded gunpowder. Under Mongol rule, Chinese engineers also developed naval mines. They placed a bomb in an inflated animal skin and used an incense stick as the fuse. The bomb floated on the water near an enemy ship until the incense stick burned down and set off the gunpowder. The Mongols in China borrowed the catapult design from the Persians, which could hurl large stones or explode bombs. The Chinese referred to one kind of catapult as the Muslim engine. Marco Polo claims to have taught the Mongols how to build a trebuchet, a type of catapult, but these devices were already used before he arrived in China. Trebuchet catapults employ a weight system to adjust the missile's firing range. Persian culture and the Mongols. When the Mongols invaded Persia, they found another country with a long and rich cultural history. The First Persian Empire peaked around 500 BCE and spread from the Oxus River to northern Egypt. Persia also served as the center for two later empires. The Persians absorbed the art and technology of ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. Ancient Greece and Rome influenced the Persian Empire as it weakened. Islam emerged as the final significant cultural influence on the region, reaching Persia shortly after its founding in the 7th century. The rulers of Persia before the Mongols were the Seljuks, a nomadic Turkic people who had converted to Islam. They used Arabic, Islam's language in religious affairs, and Persian under their rule. Eventually, Persian became the official language of the state. Since the Mongol Ilkhans relied on Persian officials to run the government, Persian remained the major everyday language. According to modern scholar Abolala Sudavar, writing in the court of the Ilkhans 1290-1340, Persian officials in the Mongol government also were able to lure Mongol royalty into the wonderful world of Persian literature and culture. The women's arts in the Khanate. In its long history, Persia has had many outstanding poets. Under the Seljuks, some poets wrote book-length works on personal subjects. Others wrote poems praising their rulers. However, poetry declined in Persia during the first decades of the Mongol conquest. Many poets and artists died during the invasions or fled to other countries. Under Mongol rule, poetry never regained the prominence it once had. The city of Shiraz, however, escaped Mongol destruction, producing several notable poets. One of these was Sa'di, some 1184-1291, who followed a branch of Islam called Sufism. Sufis believe a person must go beyond the rules and regulations of religious life and search for a direct experience of God. Sa'di's most famous. His work, the Gulistan, Rose Garden, uses poetry and short sayings to instruct others, especially rulers, on living a positive and meaningful life. He wrote in Gulistan, "All this is nothing as it passes away. Throne and luck, command and prohibition, taking and giving." The poet meant that power and riches do not last forever and are unimportant to living a spiritual life. Although poetry struggled under the Mongols, another form of literature peaked. Historiography studies history by looking at different original sources over time. The idea is to uncover how earlier historians may have distorted facts or made errors. It is the history of a particular subject. This study requires a historian to carefully weigh other historians' methods and prejudices. Under the Mongols, Persian scholars excelled at historiography and general history. In the Cambridge History of Iran, J. Ripka says, "The principal historical works of the Mongol period are among the finest ever produced by any of the Islamic people." The historical writing of the Ilkhanate rested on several key factors. For one, the Mongols believed they were on a divine mission to rule the world and wanted their reign well documented. The Persians also had access to documents from all across the Mongol Empire. Some historians lived during the events they described, so they could add descriptions and quotes from their direct knowledge. At their best, the Persians wrote history, which was also excellent literature. The first of the outstanding Persian historians under the Mongols was Juvaini, 1226–1283. He worked for the Mongol government, serving in Baghdad. His greatest work was the 3-volume History of the World Conqueror, about Chinggis and the Mongol Empire, until 1258. The first volume detailed Chinggis' rise to power and included the brief rule of his son Kuyuk. The second volume focused on Khwarezm and Persia and the Mongol presence there. The last dealt with Munkar Khan's reign in the 1250s. Even more notable was Rashid al-Din, 1247–1318. He originally trained as a doctor, but served as a Mongol official and a historian. Rashid al-Din worked for Ilkhan Ghazan, who asked him to write a history of the Mongols in Persia. The scholar went beyond that, writing a multi-volume work that included a history of Mongol China and Europe. Persian visual arts. In arts and crafts, the Persians continued many old Seljuk styles during the Mongols' rule. Through the end of the 13th century, ceramics and other crafts commonly used certain images. These included representations of stars and planets, and people performing everyday activities. Artisans also illustrated scenes from the Shah-Nama, Book of Kings, a poetic history of Persia's rulers. Centuries after the Mongols lost control in Persia, Iranian scholars wrote that painting blossomed under Mongol rule. Rashid al-Din started a school for artists, and Ghazan and the Ilkhans who followed him supported the arts. When the Ilkhans commissioned a history of their rule, similar to the Shah-Nama, it greatly enhanced the painting. The Mongols commissioned Persian artists to illustrate historical scenes, leading to the development of illustrated books as a lasting art form in Persia. Small, detailed paintings, known as miniatures, were required to illustrate the books. These works incorporated elements of Chinese artistic styles. The drawing of mountains and people reflects the Chinese influence. The Persian artists were the true masters of miniature painting. Rashid al-Din also played a role in the Mongol-era building projects. Persian architecture, featuring domed buildings with as many as 12 sides, reflected styles throughout the Islamic world. The wealthy Persians and Mongols of the Ilkhanate spent lavishly on large burial complexes. Building public tombs was a break from tradition for the Mongols. In their nomadic past, Mongol rulers always buried themselves in secret locations. With their conversion to Islam, the Ilkhans followed the example of earlier Persian rulers. For example, Ghazan constructed a 12-sided tomb encircled by a mosque, school, and hospital. The complex also featured a pool house and a fountain. Later rulers of Persia and neighboring lands, such as the Ottoman Turks, copied the Mongol style in burial sites. In Sultania, Ilkhan ul-Yaitu built himself a large tomb complex, or mausoleum. Mongol rulers have hailed this domed mausoleum as one of their greatest construction projects. Part of the mausoleum still stands in Sultania, where it is a popular tourist attraction. Persian science. Persia and other lands of the Middle East benefited from their exposure to both Western and Indian scientific traditions. As a result, Islamic scholars were known for their scientific and mathematical pursuits. Islamic scholars used mathematics to calculate the positions of stars and planets, thereby contributing to creating accurate calendars. Islamic scholars laid the foundation for modern algebra, and the Arabic word al-jabr, meaning the joining of disorganized parts, inspired the word algebra. Persian mathematicians mostly improved on work from a few centuries earlier under the Mongols, rather than making new discoveries. In astronomy, however, scientists under the Mongols excelled. Nasir al-Din was the first Persian to work for the Mongols, 1200–1273. Hulagu built an observatory for him at Maraga in northwest Iran. Hulagu's observatory at Maraga in northwest Iran is the world's first true observatory for studying the skies. Nasir al-Din and other astronomers studied the orbits of the planets. A scientist named Kamal al-Din, D. Chinakama 1320, studied at the Maraga Observatory, but focused more on light than the stars and planets. He wanted to understand why humans saw rainbows. His experiments taught him that light passing through water at a certain angle creates the colors that make up a rainbow. Art and culture in Mongol Russia. The kings of the Golden Horde did not inherit the same rich cultures as those in China and Persia. In many ways, they remained truer to their native Mongol culture. Still, historians believe they did promote some arts and sciences, although the historical evidence needs to be stronger. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church provided major support for the arts, and the Mongol policy of religious tolerance also played a significant role. The church flourished. It was able to construct additional churches and commission religious artwork. The most common art form was icons of saints and other holy figures painted on wood. People kept icons in their homes and considered them holy objects. Icons were powerful symbols of the importance of the Christian faith, especially among uneducated peasants who could not read the Bible. Although icon painting developed centuries earlier in the Byzantine Empire, icons became more common during the Mongol era, especially in Novgorod and Moscow. During the first years of the Mongol conquest, icon painting suffered. The art form regained strength when the Mongols ended their attacks and collected tribute. The Russian Orthodox Church also shaped musical development in Russia. The introduction of Christianity brought chanting, a form of sung prayer. The Russians blended folk songs with Byzantine chanting traditions to create the Znameni chant. This musical form survived through the Mongol era, although written records of the chants did not. During the Mongol period, Russian literature primarily consisted of chronicles. These chronicles recorded the historical events of the city-states that emerged before and during the Golden Horde's rule. However, the chronicles also contained elements of myth or fable, making them only sometimes reliable sources of true history. Most chronicles focused on religious and political events and ideas, trying to build pride in the Orthodox Church and local leaders. The Mongols began to appear in the chronicles after the first Mongol invasions, though the authors sometimes seem to ignore Mongol rule. The first mention of Tatars in Novgorod chronicles is, "No one knew who they were or where they came from. Today they come to take our land, and they will come to take yours tomorrow," as quoted in Charles J. Halperin's The Tatar Yoke. The cultural world of the Ulus Chagatai. As in the Golden Horde lands, the Ulus Chagatai rulers largely remained true to their Mongol cultural roots. Turkic, Persian, and Arab cultures influenced the Mongols in Central Asia. Sources. The Mongols avoided the region's large cities, where art and culture, influenced by Islam, had flourished for several centuries. The sedentary areas that survived the Mongol invasion did not see many changes. The cities of Transoxiana continued to educate their children and support artisans. During the 12th century, the region had produced one of the greatest medieval doctors, known in Europe as Avicenna, 980–1037. People throughout the Middle East and parts of Christian lands read his medical books. Other notable books from the pre-Mongol period included a dictionary of Turkic phrases. The Ulus Chagatai saw a significant period of artistic expression under the rulers who followed Timur, known as the Timurids. The Timurids turned away from conquest and focused on large building projects, mostly in Samarkand. On the walls of some buildings were elaborate mosaics, pictures made with pieces of colored tile. The greatest Timurid patron of art and science may have been Ulugh Beg, 1394–49, a grandson of Timur. On the wall of one school he built, according to Svat Suchek in A History of Inner Asia, were the words, "The search for knowledge is every Muslim's duty." The astronomers he gathered created detailed charts of the stars, correcting mistakes from earlier works. Ulugh Beg himself participated in some of this work. He also found time to write poetry and compose music. His brother Baisunghur, a 1397–1433, had a similar influence on Central Asian culture in Herat, in what is now Afghanistan. Despite their reputation as violent barbarians, the various branches of Chinggis's family played a role in keeping the arts and sciences alive for several centuries. The ancient cultures of Persia and China continued to thrive, and ideas shared across Mongol lands influenced old ways of thinking and creating art. The weakening and eventual collapse of the empire. Timur's creation did not end Mongol involvement in Central Asian politics. Several more dynasties with family ties to Chinggis Khan emerged. However, these later Mongols had little in common with those from the 13th century. Most new rulers spoke Turkic, practiced Islam, and knew Persian culture. The traditional homelands and the lands bordering them were the exclusive domains of the Mongol language and culture. Shiban, the grandson of Chinggis, dates unknown, once owned an ulus where the Uzbeks, with Mongol ties, originated. This land near the Ural Mountains bordered the Russian territory of the Golden Horde. In the 1430s, the Uzbeks moved close to Transoxiana, and in the early 1500s, their ruler, Muhammad Shibani, 1451–1510, took control of Timur's former lands. A true descendant of Chinggis now ruled a large part of the Ulus Chagatai, the Mughals of India. The last powerful dynasty with ties to Chinggis peaked in lands outside the traditional Mongol Empire in India. Since the middle of the 14th century, the eastern half of Chagatai's old realm has been known as Moghul-li-stan. Moghuls were the people who lived there. People sometimes write Moghul as Mughal in English, referring to a dynasty that ruled northern India for nearly 4 centuries. The founder of this dynasty was Zahiruddin Babur, 1483–1530, a descendant of Timur who also had family ties to Chinggis. From his base in Fergana, a region now in Uzbekistan, he wanted to re-establish Timur's old empire. To start the 16th century, the Uzbeks and Persians ruled most of those lands. Therefore, Babur chose to invade northern India instead. Timur had. After his victories, Babur used his ancestors' previous conquests to justify his rule. Babur's Mughal dynasty thrived thanks to the gold and silver of northern India. His successor created an empire covering 2/3 of modern India and parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Through the 17th century, the Mughal leaders considered themselves Central Asians, not Indians. They treasured their ties to Timur, and the first rulers of the dynasty honored their Mongol heritage. They often noted in official records that they followed the rules and customs of Chinggis Khan. The Mughals built one of the world's greatest empires. Some of their kings dreamed of winning back their ancestors' homelands in Central Asia, but they never fulfilled that dream. The Russian Empire. A later empire did span the lands of the old Ulus Chagatai, including the former Golden Horde and part of the Ilkhanate. With the end of Mongol control in Russia, the princes of Moscow rose to create the modern Russian state. The Russian emperors, also known as Tsars, extended their influence into Central Asia. For the first time, Europeans ruled many of the former Mongol territories. The Russians, however, were not typical Europeans. Mongol rule in the 13th and 14th centuries had shaped their culture and politics. By the 17th century, Russia's Tsars were moving eastward across the northern part of Eurasia. They had already defeated the remnants of the Golden Horde, except the Crimean Tatars. During the 18th century, Russia moved into the steppes of Central Asia, the heart of the Mongol Empire. Turco-Mongol traders worked with Russian merchants, and Khans of small Tatar groups declared their loyalty to the Tsars. Where they could not take over peacefully, the Russians used superior military force to take control of former Mongol lands. By the end of the 18th century, Russia had built its empire in Central Asia. Historian Hidehiro Okada, in his book The Mongol Empire and Its Legacy, asserts that the Russians found it easier to establish there. Chinggis, hundreds of years ago, set the precedent for rule. The Great Khan asserted his divine right to unite the world, and the concept of a single powerful state spanning Central Asia persisted long after Chinggis's demise. The Russian presence brought peace to a region where local rivalries often led to war. The Russians also brought modern European technology to the nomadic lands, building the first railroads and telegraph lines. The reign of the Russian Khazar in Central Asia also encouraged numerous Russians and Ukrainians to establish themselves in the region, thereby promoting the Russian language. Orthodox Christianity. Still, Islam and traditional languages continued to thrive. However, the benefits of Russian rule were accompanied by policies as detrimental as the worst aspects of Mongol dominance in Russia. The Tsars imposed heavy taxes and forced civilians into military service. They also supported serfdom, a system similar to slavery that forced peasants to work for wealthy landowners. Serfs had some legal protections, but could not leave their masters' lands. Russian serfdom did not end until 1861. Siberia and Central Asia never implemented serfdom. Russia's eastward movement across Asia brought it into direct contact with China and Mongolia. The Qing dynasty ruled China by the 19th century. As the Russians had done, the Qing emperors claimed a right to rule all the lands around them because of their historical link to the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols. China took control of Mongolia in 1691. The Qing emperors tightly controlled the Mongol nobles in this part of the old Mongol homelands, known as Inner Mongolia. The part of the Mongol homeland that remained under the control of local nobles, descended from Chinggis Khan, was known as Outer Mongolia. Modern Mongolia. 1917. Russian revolutionaries overthrew their country's last Tsar and eventually installed a communist government. Under communism, the state owns almost all property. One political party, the Communist Party, controls the government and the economy. The Russian communists divided the vast territory they controlled into a series of republics, all united under the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Moscow was the capital of this new nation, and Russia was the dominant republic. The Soviet Union created 14 other Soviet social stat republics, most of which had once been part of the Mongol Empire. The Ulus Chagatai, the northeastern part of the Ilkhanate, and the southern and eastern lands of the Golden Horde formed the center of these territories. The five in Central Asia were Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were under Ilkhanate influence, while the Golden Horde ruled or influenced what became Russia, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, all these republics became independent nations. In 1921, Soviet troops helped the Mongolians in Outer Mongolia defeat Chinese forces, and Russians who opposed communism. In 1924, Mongolia declared independence as the People's Republic of Mongolia. In reality, it came under the direct influence of the Soviet Union. Some Mongols also lived in lands that were part of the Soviet Union. Under Soviet domination, Mongolia adopted a communist government. As in the Soviet Union, members of the Communist Party dominated all aspects of politics and the economy. Officials cracked down on the Mongolians' traditional religions, Buddhism and shamanism. The communists destroyed temples and killed monks. The Soviets forced the Mongolians to abandon their traditional writing system and use the Russian alphabet. The Soviet influence also led to some positive changes. Education became more widespread, and farming methods improved. Still, the Mongols lacked political and cultural freedom. They also became extremely isolated from the rest of the world. The Soviets set up military bases across Mongolia and pressured the country to forbid tourism to maintain secrecy at these bases. In 1990, when Mongolians began demanding changes in their government, some protesters carried signs saying, "Morindu, mount up." This was the same cry Chinggis Khan used to send his troops into battle. Mongolia lost its ties to the Soviets in 1991, and Mongolian leaders began creating democratic political systems. Today, the Mongols try to balance their nomadic ways from the past with modern life. While people continue to live in felt gurs, a solar-powered satellite dish outside each tent receives television signals from around the world. Young boys continue to learn how to ride horses bareback, and they may eventually attend college to study engineering. Journalist Glenn Hodges quotes Mongolian Prime Minister Nambarin Enkbaya in an article from the October 2003 issue of National Geographic as saying, "Nomads." Yet many Mongols still choose the nomadic life, their main tie to the past glory of Chinggis Khan. Finding a balance between old and new ways of life is one of many challenges facing Mongolians today. Mongolia has recently discovered huge deposits of gold and copper. Experts estimate the country's gold and copper ore reserves are worth at least $38 billion. Mining this metal brings wealth, but also damages the environment. Modern Mongolia must now try to balance its need for the wealth these minerals provide with a desire to preserve its natural environment.